The little girl was dying under 800 pounds of steel. Her father lay unconscious on the pavement. And 12-year-old Mason had a choice to make in the next 5 seconds. Run to the adoption meeting that could finally give him a family, or stay with a stranger's screaming child and lose everything. Mason chose wrong, or so he thought, because they told Mason that nobody wanted broken kids. 12 years in shelters. 12 years of watching families choose everyone but you. So when that adoption letter finally came, he'd promised himself, don't screw this up. But when he heard that little girl scream, he broke his promise instantly, threw away his only chance at a family to save someone else's child. That night, Mason cried himself to sleep believing his future was destroyed. He had no idea that the biggest motorcycle club in the city was planning to show up at dawn, or that the man whose daughter he saved was about to give him something no adoption papers ever could. Before we dive into Mason's incredible journey, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city and state in the comments right now. Let's see how far this story reaches. Are you watching from Texas, California, New York, Florida? Comment below, and let's build a community of people who believe in second chances and the power of kindness. And if you're new here, welcome to a channel that celebrates real heroes and true stories that restore your faith in humanity. Now, let me take you back to that Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. The first light of dawn crept through the narrow windows of the Grand Street shelter, casting pale yellow stripes across rows of metal bunk beds. In the third bed from the door, 12-year-old Mason stirred awake, his fingers instinctively tightening around a white envelope pressed against his chest. Even in sleep, he'd held onto it. Even in dreams, he couldn't let it go. The envelope was wrinkled now, creased from 6 nights of being clutched like a lifeline, the edges softened from constant handling. Mason blinked against the early morning light and sat up slowly, careful not to wake the boy sleeping in the bunk below him. He pulled the letter out and read it again, though he'd already memorized every word. Dear Mason, we are pleased to inform you that a family has expressed interest in meeting you for potential placement. His caseworker, Ms. Rivera, had cried when she'd given it to him. Actually cried. In 3 years of working with her, Mason had never seen her cry. This was his first adoption meeting, his first real chance. Mason swung his legs over the side of the bunk and dropped silently to the floor, his bare feet landing on cold linoleum that had been mopped the night before. The shelter smelled like industrial cleaner and the lingering scent of last night's dinner, some kind of pasta with red sauce that hadn't been terrible but hadn't been great either. He moved through the sleeping room like a ghost, practiced at not making noise, practiced at not disturbing anyone, practiced at being invisible. 12 years in the system had taught him how to take up as little space as possible. He'd been at the Grand Street shelter for 3 years now. Before that, a group home in the suburbs. Before that, a foster placement that lasted exactly 19 days. Before that, other places that blurred together in his memory like watercolors left in the rain. 12 years total. His entire conscious life had been spent in rooms that weren't his, sleeping in beds that belonged to someone else, eating food prepared by people who were paid to feed him. In the corner of the sleeping area, Mason kept his belongings in a plastic bin with his name written on masking tape. Everything he owned in the world fit inside. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, underwear and socks that the shelter provided, a winter coat that was getting too small, and a shoe box containing his treasures. He pulled out the shoe box now and opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph of 2 people he barely remembered, a woman with kind eyes and a man with Mason's same dark hair. His parents. They died when he was 3, a car accident, and Mason had no memory of them beyond this single faded photograph. Beneath the photo was a notebook, spiral-bound and nearly full, where Mason had been practicing for months. He opened to a fresh page and wrote in careful handwriting, "My name is Mason. I'm 12 years old. I like reading, especially adventure books. I'm good at math. I always clean up after myself. I promise I won't be any trouble." He'd written variations of this introduction 47 times, trying to find the perfect words, trying to figure out what would make a family want him. What made a child choosable? Mason didn't know, but he'd been studying it like other kids studied for tests. Be polite. Smile, but not too much. Answer questions clearly. Don't talk about the hard stuff. Don't mention the loneliness. Don't let them see how desperately you need this. The bathroom was shared by 15 boys, and Mason waited his turn at the sink, brushing his teeth with the toothbrush that had his name written on the handle in permanent marker. In the mirror, he practiced his smile. Not too big, not too eager. Friendly, approachable, normal. He'd borrowed a button-down shirt from one of the older boys, a kid named Jerome who was aging out of the system next month and wouldn't need dress clothes anymore. The shirt was too big, the shoulders hanging past where they should, but Mason had rolled up the sleeves and tucked it in carefully. It would have to do. Today was Tuesday. The meeting was at 2:30 in the afternoon at the social services office downtown. Mason had walked the route 3 times already, timing himself. 32 minutes at a normal pace. He'd planned to leave at 1:45, which would get him there with plenty of time to spare, enough time to catch his breath and make sure he didn't arrive sweaty or rushed. The Hoffmans, that was their name. He knew everything about them because Ms. Rivera had told him everything she was allowed to share. They were in their late 40s, married for 23 years, no other children. Mr. Hoffman worked in accounting. Mrs. Hoffman was a librarian. They lived in a 2-story house with a yard. They had a dog named Biscuit. They specifically wanted an older child, someone who could be independent, someone mature. Mason had repeated these facts to himself so many times they'd become a kind of prayer. Back at his bunk, Mason sat with his journal open and wrote one more line. This is it. This is finally it. Around him, the shelter was beginning to wake up. Other boys stretching, yawning, shuffling toward the bathroom. The morning routine starting like it did every day, except this wasn't every day. This was the day that could change everything. Mason folded the adoption letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, then tucked it into the pocket of his jeans, close to his heart. Safe. He had no idea that in exactly 4 hours, he'd be making a choice that would haunt him forever or save him in ways he couldn't imagine. But first, he had to get through the morning without falling apart. If you've ever felt like nobody chose you, like you were always the one left behind, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button if you believe every kid deserves a chance, because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity, but only if you stay until the end. The trolls who say homeless kids are hopeless, they won't make it through this story. Mason had been through this before. Not the adoption meeting part, that was new, but the hope part, the believing part, the letting yourself imagine what it might be like to have a family part. And every single time before, that hope had been carefully, methodically crushed. 7 times. 7 different families or foster placements. 7 different reasons why Mason wasn't quite right. The first family, when he was 8 years old, had seemed perfect at first. The Caldwells. They had a nice house in the suburbs with a swing set in the backyard and a golden retriever that licked Mason's face the first time they met. Mason had stayed with them for 4 days before Mrs. Caldwell sat him down at the kitchen table and said, very gently, that he was too quiet. She'd used that exact phrase. You're a sweet boy, Mason, but you're just too quiet. We need a child who's more outgoing, someone who'll fit in better with our lifestyle. Mason hadn't understood what that meant. He'd thought being quiet was good. He'd thought not causing trouble was what adults wanted. Then there was the couple who'd come to the group home when Mason was 9, young and enthusiastic, taking photos and asking questions. They'd spent 2 hours with Mason, playing board games and talking about their house by the lake. Mason had allowed himself to imagine learning to swim, to fish, to be part of a family that laughed easily and held hands. 3 weeks later, Ms. Rivera had pulled him aside and explained that the couple had chosen a different child. A younger one, a 5-year-old boy with dimples and an infectious giggle. Sometimes people want babies, Ms. Rivera had said, her voice carefully neutral. Sometimes they want kids who smile more. It's not about you, Mason. But it always felt like it was about him. There was the foster home when he was 10, run by a woman named Mrs. Patterson who took in 4 kids at a time. Mason had lasted exactly 21 days before she'd called social services and asked for him to be removed. He's not adjusting, she'd said, though Mason had done everything right. He'd followed every rule, cleaned his space, helped with chores, never complained. Apparently, that wasn't enough. Apparently, there was something wrong with him that he couldn't see, but everyone else could. The other placements blurred together after that. The family who decided they wanted a girl instead. The couple who got pregnant unexpectedly and no longer needed to foster. The home where Mason had broken a lamp by accident and was sent back the next day, as if that one mistake proved he was irredeemable. Each rejection carved a little deeper, taught him to expect less, to hope smaller, to build walls higher. Ms. Rivera had been his caseworker for 3 years now, since he'd arrived at the Grand Street shelter. She was in her 50s. With graying hair she kept in a practical bun and eyes that had seen too much, but somehow still held kindness. She'd fought for Mason in ways he didn't fully understand, making phone calls, filling out paperwork, advocating when other caseworkers might have given up. When she'd handed him the letter about the Hoffmans 6 days ago, her hands had been shaking. "Mason," she'd said, sitting across from him in the cramped office at the shelter, "I want you to understand something. This process takes time. They've done the home study, the background checks, the interviews. They've been approved for adoption. They've reviewed files for dozens of children. And they asked to meet you specifically." Mason had stared at the letter, unable to process the words. "Why me?" "Because they're looking for an older child. Someone mature. Someone who can be part of their lives in a meaningful way. They don't want a baby. They want a young person they can connect with." The waiting had been torture. 6 days of trying not to think about it, of trying not to imagine what their house looked like or what it would feel like to have parents again. Mason had done his research, of course. Ms. Rivera had given him what details she could. Robert and Linda Hoffman, married 23 years. Mr. Hoffman was an accountant at a firm downtown. Mrs. Hoffman worked as a librarian at the public library on West Side. They liked hiking and old movies and had a golden retriever named Biscuit. They'd been trying to adopt for 2 years. Mason had memorized every detail like his life depended on it. Because maybe it did. He'd practiced conversations in his head. "Yes, Mrs. Hoffman, I love reading. What kind of books does the library have? And, Mr. Hoffman, I'm pretty good at math. Maybe you could help me get even better." He'd rehearsed being interested without being needy, enthusiastic without being desperate, mature without being robotic. The adoption process was complicated in ways Mason didn't fully understand. There were legal requirements and waiting periods, evaluations and approvals. But this meeting was the first step. This was where the Hoffmans would decide if Mason was worth pursuing. If he was worth the months of paperwork and court dates and home visits that would follow. If he was worth becoming their son. Mason sat on his bunk that Tuesday morning, the envelope still in his pocket, and allowed himself the smallest, most fragile hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time he'd finally found the family that would choose him. Maybe this time he wouldn't be too quiet or too old or too broken or too whatever indefinable thing had made all the others turn away. Mason didn't know it yet, but the Hoffmans had already made their decision before today's meeting. And what happened in the next few hours would make that decision completely irrelevant. In exactly 2 hours, Mason would learn that family doesn't always come from adoption papers. Sometimes it comes from blood, the kind you shed protecting someone else's child. Mason left the Grand Street shelter at exactly 1:47 in the afternoon. He'd been watching the clock on the wall in the common room for the past hour, his leg bouncing with nervous energy, unable to sit still but afraid to move too much and wrinkle his borrowed shirt. When the minute hand finally clicked to the right position, he stood up, took a deep breath, and walked out the front door into the mild October afternoon. The meeting was at 2:30. 32 minutes to walk there. He'd timed it 3 times already. That gave him 11 minutes of buffer, enough time to catch his breath and compose himself before walking into the social services office. Enough time to make sure he didn't arrive flushed and sweating like someone who couldn't handle simple tasks. The city was alive with its usual Tuesday rhythm. Cars moved through intersections in steady streams, their tires humming against asphalt still warm from the afternoon sun. Pedestrians walked with purpose, heading back to offices after lunch breaks, talking on phones, carrying shopping bags. Normal people living normal lives, none of them aware that Mason's entire future hung in the balance of the next hour. His route took him through the downtown corridor first, past storefronts with mannequins in windows and coffee shops with outdoor seating where people sipped lattes and scrolled through their phones. Mason kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, his hand in his pocket wrapped around the envelope that contained the letter. The paper was soft now from constant handling, but he needed to feel it there. Physical proof that this was real, that someone actually wanted to meet him. He passed the park at Fletcher and Main, a small green space with benches and a playground where he'd slept rough for 2 weeks when he was 10, before a police officer had found him and brought him to the shelter. Mason didn't look at it directly, didn't want to remember those nights, but the memory pressed against his consciousness anyway. Cold ground, empty stomach, The absolute terror of being alone in the dark. He walked faster. The bridge came next, spanning the river that cut through the city's center. Mason's footsteps echoed on the pedestrian walkway, competing with the sound of traffic rushing past. Below, the water moved sluggishly, reflecting the gray blue of the October sky. He checked his watch. 1:54. He was making good time. His mental rehearsal started again, the same loop he'd been running for 6 days. Hi, I'm Mason. I'm 12 years old. I like reading and helping people. I promise I'll be good. Too desperate? Maybe drop the promise part. Hi, I'm Mason. I'm 12 years old. I enjoy reading, especially adventure stories. I'm good at math and I always help with chores. Better. More normal. Less needy. He checked his watch again. 1:57. 23 minutes until he had to be there. His heart was pounding so hard, he could feel it in his throat. What if they didn't like him? What if he said something wrong? What if there was some invisible quality he lacked? The same quality that had made 7 other families turn away. Mason's grip tightened on the envelope in his pocket. He couldn't think like that. Ms. Rivera had said they specifically asked to meet him. That meant something. That had to mean something. The downtown buildings gave way to the administrative district, lower structures made of brick and concrete. Government offices and social services agencies clustered together. Mason knew this area. He'd been to the social services building dozens of times over the years for meetings, evaluations, check-ins. But today was different. Today wasn't about reviewing his case or discussing his behavior or figuring out why another placement had failed. Today was about moving forward. Today was about finally getting chosen. He checked his watch again. 2:03. He was 12 minutes away from the building now, right on schedule. The afternoon air was mild, comfortable, the kind of weather that made you forget summer was gone and winter was coming. Traffic moved normally through the intersections, nothing unusual, just another Tuesday in the city. Mason walked with purpose, his borrowed shirt tucked neatly into his jeans, his hair combed as well as he could manage without any product. He looked presentable. He looked like a kid who deserved a chance. Mason was 17 minutes from changing his life forever, just not in the way he imagined. Because fate was already setting its trap 3 blocks ahead, where a black SUV was running late and about to make a catastrophic decision. Comment, choose Mason if you're already rooting for this kid, because what's about to happen will break your heart before it rebuilds it. And if you think homeless children are society's responsibility, hit that like button. Show the algorithm that compassion matters. Mason reached the intersection of Monroe and 5th at 2:18 in the afternoon, 12 minutes ahead of schedule. The social services building was visible now, just 2 more blocks east, a squat brick structure with narrow windows and a parking lot that was always half empty. He could see it from where he stood on the corner, close enough that he could walk there in 3 minutes if he hurried. But he didn't want to hurry. Didn't want to arrive breathless and rushed, didn't want the Hoffmans to see him as someone who couldn't manage time properly. So Mason stopped at the corner, positioned himself near a bus stop bench, and allowed himself to breathe. The borrowed shirt clung to his back with a thin layer of nervous sweat despite the mild weather. He had time to let that dry. Time to calm his racing heart. Time to run through his introduction one more time. The intersection was busy, but not chaotic. Traffic lights cycled through their colors with mechanical precision. Cars stopped and went. Pedestrians crossed with the walk signals. Everything following the established rhythm of a functioning city. Mason checked his watch again, a nervous habit he couldn't break. 2:19. 11 minutes until his entire life potentially changed. 3 blocks away, though Mason had no way of knowing this, Victor Brennan was navigating his Harley-Davidson through the same afternoon traffic, his 7-year-old daughter Iris seated behind him with her small arms wrapped tight around his waist. Vic was 43 years old, built like someone who'd spent time in the military and never stopped training. His leather vest bore the colors of the Hells Angels, patches earned over 15 years with the charter, including his position as president. Before the motorcycle club, he'd been a Marine, 2 tours in Afghanistan, decorated for valor and sent home with scars both visible and not. 3 years ago, Vic had become a single father when his wife Elena succumbed to cancer after a brutal 18-month fight. Since then, it had been just him and Iris, navigating life together with the help of his charter brothers who'd become uncles and protectors to the little girl who'd stolen all their hearts. Iris was everything bright in Vic's world. 7 years old with her mother's dark curls and her father's stubborn determination. She wore a miniature leather jacket that matched her dad's, custom-made by one of the club members, but underneath it was a pink tutu from her ballet class. That was Iris in a nutshell, the beautiful contradiction, a biker's daughter who loved motorcycles and tutus with equal passion. They were heading home from her Tuesday afternoon ballet lesson, taking the route through downtown, because Iris loved watching the city from the back of the bike. Neither Mason nor Vic nor Iris knew about the black SUV 4 blocks north, weaving through traffic with increasing aggression. The driver was a real estate agent named Kevin Marsh, running 23 minutes late for a showing that could make or break his month's commission. His phone sat in his lap, screen glowing with text messages from his increasingly irritated clients. Kevin's eyes flicked down to read the latest message, his attention split between the road and the screen, his foot pressing harder on the accelerator. Mason stood at the corner of Monroe and Fifth, watching the traffic light change from red to green. A group of pedestrians crossed in front of him. A delivery truck rumbled past, its engine loud enough to rattle the bus stop shelter. Mason checked his watch again. 2:20. 10 minutes. His stomach churned with anticipation and dread in equal measure. The city hummed around him, thousands of people moving through their ordinary days, making ordinary decisions, heading to ordinary destinations. No one knew that in less than a minute, ordinary was about to shatter into chaos. In exactly 45 seconds, 3 lives were about to collide in a way that would change everything. Mason, about to lose his future. Vic, about to lose his daughter. And Iris, about to lose consciousness under 800 pounds of motorcycle steel. None of them saw it coming. But before we get to the moment that breaks everything, you need to understand something about Mason. He'd spent his entire life being invisible. In 10 seconds, he was about to become the most important person in the world. The sound hit first. Screeching tires. Metal grinding against asphalt. A child's scream that cut through the afternoon air like a knife through silk. Mason's head snapped up from checking his watch, his body reacting before his mind could process what was happening. The black SUV came through the intersection at 45 miles per hour, blowing straight through a red light that had been solid for at least 3 seconds. The driver's face was illuminated by the glow of a phone screen, eyes down, completely oblivious. Vic saw it half a second before impact, jerked his handlebars hard to the right in a desperate attempt to avoid the collision. But there was no time, no space, no escape. The SUV's front quarter panel clipped the Harley's rear wheel, and everything exploded into chaos. For Mason, the next 5 seconds unfolded in horrifying slow motion. The motorcycle lurched sideways, physics taking over in the cruelest possible way. Vic's body launched upward and to the left, separating from the bike midair like a rag doll thrown by an angry child. 800 pounds of steel and chrome went down hard, sparks flying as metal scraped concrete. The bike slid 30 feet in a screaming arc across the intersection, and Iris, still attached, disappeared beneath it. Vic hit the curb headfirst. The sound of skull meeting concrete was sickening, a dull wet crack that Mason would hear in his nightmares for years. Blood appeared instantly, dark and spreading, pooling on the sidewalk around Vic's motionless head. The motorcycle came to rest at a grotesque angle, the engine still running, rear wheel spinning uselessly in the air. And beneath it, pinned and screaming, was Iris. The black SUV never even slowed. Its brake lights flashed once, a brief red flare. Then the vehicle accelerated through the intersection and disappeared around the corner. Gone. Witnesses would later report the license plate to police. Later, Kevin Marsh would be arrested at his office. But in this moment, he was just another hit-and-run driver fleeing the scene of devastation. Mason stood frozen. 3 seconds of absolute paralysis, his brain unable to reconcile what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to walk to his meeting, supposed to meet the Hoffmans, supposed to finally get chosen. This wasn't part of the plan. Around him, other bystanders reacted in the predictable ways humans react to sudden tragedy. A woman screamed. A man shouted for someone to call 911. 2 teenagers pulled out their phones and started filming, because that's what people do now. They document trauma instead of interrupting it. But no one moved toward the wreckage. No one ran to help. Except Mason. His body moved before his brain caught up, legs carrying him forward in a dead sprint toward the intersection. The envelope slipped from his pocket, white paper catching the breeze, the adoption letter from the Hoffmans scattering across the street. Individual pages lifted and tumbled away like dying birds. Mason didn't notice, didn't care. There was only the screaming and the blood and the little girl trapped beneath 800 pounds of steel. He reached Iris first. She was conscious. Thank God she was conscious. But her face was twisted in agony and terror. Her right leg was pinned beneath the motorcycle at an unnatural angle, trapped between the bike's frame and the asphalt. The mini leather jacket she wore was scraped and torn. Her pink tutu, visible beneath the jacket, was shredded on one side. Fuel was leaking from the bike's tank, a dark stream spreading across the concrete, the smell sharp and chemical and dangerous. "Daddy!" Iris screamed, her voice raw and breaking. "Daddy, help me! Daddy!" Mason dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering uselessly, not sure where to touch, not sure how to help. Hey, I'm here. I'm right here. What's your name?" "Iris," she sobbed, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. "Where's my daddy? I want my daddy." Mason looked over at Vic, 10 feet away, motionless on the sidewalk with blood pooling around his head like a dark halo. The man wasn't moving, wasn't responding. Mason couldn't tell if he was breathing. "Your daddy's okay." Mason lied, because what else could he say? "He's okay, but I need you to stay calm for me, Iris. Can you do that? Can you stay calm?" "It hurts," she wailed. "My leg hurts so bad." I know it does. I'm going to help you. I promise I'm going to help you." Mason's watch read 2:23. 7 minutes until his meeting. The social services building was 6 blocks away. He could see it from here, past the traffic, past the gathering crowd. He could still run, could still make it. Someone else would help this little girl. Someone else would call the ambulance, would lift the bike, would handle this crisis. Someone else. But then Iris's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her small fingers digging into his skin like claws. Her eyes locked onto his, brown and terrified and desperate, and she said 6 words that changed everything. "Please don't leave me. Please." Mason looked at that little girl, then at his adoption papers blowing down the street, then back at those terrified eyes. And in that moment, he made the decision that would cost him everything he'd ever wanted. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that this little girl's family never forgets. And the Hells Angels always pay their debts. Mason's knees hit the pavement hard enough to bruise, but he didn't feel it. His entire focus narrowed to the problem in front of him. 800 pounds of motorcycle pinning a 7-year-old girl to the ground, fuel pooling beneath them both, and a dozen ways this could go catastrophically wrong. He'd never been trained for this. Never taken a first aid class or gone through emergency response drills. But for 2 years, when he was 9 and 10, Mason had lived in a shelter on Parker Street, directly across from Fire Station 17. He'd spent countless afternoons sitting on the shelter's front steps, watching the firefighters run their training exercises, watching them practice vehicle extrications, watching them problem-solve under pressure, watching them stay calm when everything was chaos. He'd absorbed it all without realizing he was learning, filed it away in his brain as something interesting but irrelevant to his life. Now it was the most relevant thing in the world. Mason's eyes scanned the wreckage with surprising clarity. The motorcycle lay on its right side, the engine still rumbling, that rear wheel spinning slower now, but still moving. Iris's right ankle was pinned between the bike's frame and the asphalt, her leg bent at an angle that made Mason's stomach turn. The fuel leak was getting worse, spreading in a widening pool that reflected the afternoon sun like oil on water. They needed to move. Fast. "Iris," Mason said, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage. "I need you to listen to me, okay? What's your full name?" "Iris," she sobbed. "Iris Brennan. Where's my daddy? Why isn't he getting up?" "Your daddy hit his head, but he's going to be okay. My name is Mason. I'm going to get you out from under this bike, but I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that? Can you be brave?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face, her small chest heaving with panicked breaths. Mason assessed the situation like he'd seen the firefighters do. The motorcycle was too heavy for him to lift alone. He weighed maybe 90 pounds soaking wet, all bones and not enough meals. Even if he could get leverage, trying to deadlift 800 pounds would accomplish nothing except maybe hurting himself. He needed help, needed tools, needed to think. His eyes swept the intersection and locked onto a parking sign 10 feet away, The metal pole bent at the base where someone had hit it with a car weeks or months ago. It was loose, nearly falling over. Perfect. Mason ran to it, grabbed the pole with both hands, and yanked. The bent metal gave way with a screech, and suddenly he was holding a 6-foot length of steel pipe. Not ideal, but it would work as a lever if he could find the right fulcrum point. "Stay with me, Iris," Mason called as he ran back to her. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving you." He wedged one end of the pole under the motorcycle's frame, just above where Iris's leg was trapped, and looked around desperately for something to use as a fulcrum. A chunk of broken curb. That would work. Mason shoved it under the pole about 2 feet from the bike, creating a basic lever system. Other bystanders were finally moving now, shock giving way to action. A woman in a business suit was on her phone, shouting their location to a 911 operator. A man in his 50s with graying hair jogged toward Mason. "What do you need, son?" "Help me lift," Mason gasped. "We need to get the bike off her leg." The man nodded and positioned himself next to Mason on the pole. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. They pushed down on their end of the lever with everything they had. The motorcycle groaned, shifted slightly, but didn't lift enough. Iris screamed as the movement jostled her trapped ankle. Again, Mason shouted, "We need more force." Another man appeared, younger, wearing a delivery uniform. "I've got a car jack in my trunk." "Hold on." He sprinted to a sedan parked at the curb and returned 30 seconds later with a small hydraulic jack. Together, they positioned it under the bike's frame while maintaining pressure on the lever. The delivery driver worked the jack with quick, efficient pumps, and slowly, agonizingly, the motorcycle began to rise. "That's it, Iris," Mason said, never taking his eyes off her. "We're getting there. You're doing so good. So brave. Your daddy's going to be so proud of you." The bike lifted another inch. Another. The weight came off her ankle, and Iris's scream changed pitch, from trapped agony to the sharp pain of movement. Mason dropped the pole and grabbed her under the arms. "Pull her out," the older man shouted. "Now, while we've got it." Mason pulled, and Iris came free, her body sliding across the asphalt as Mason dragged her 10 feet away from the motorcycle and the spreading pool of fuel. The moment she was clear, the men let the bike down, and it crashed back to the pavement with a metallic thud. Iris was sobbing uncontrollably now, clutching at Mason's arm. Her ankle was already swelling, the skin around it turning dark purple, the joint bent wrong. Definitely broken, maybe worse. Mason pulled off his borrowed shirt without thinking, the button-down he'd planned to wear to impress the Hoffmans, and tore it into strips. He wrapped the fabric around Iris's ankle as gently as he could, creating a makeshift stabilizer, something to keep it from moving until real help arrived. "You're okay," Mason whispered, though he had no idea if that was true. "You're going to be okay, Iris. I promise." Then he remembered Vic. Mason scrambled to his feet and ran to where the biker lay motionless on the sidewalk. Up close, the head wound looked worse than it had from a distance. A deep gash above Vic's left temple bled freely, soaking into his beard, matting in his hair. His leather vest was scraped and torn. His eyes were closed. But when Mason pressed 2 fingers to Vic's neck, searching for a pulse like he'd seen in movies, he felt it. Faint. Irregular. But there. "He's alive," Mason shouted to no one in particular. The businesswoman appeared at his side, already pulling off her blazer. "Here. For the bleeding." Mason took the jacket and pressed it gently against Vic's head wound, applying pressure like some half-remembered lesson from a health class years ago. The fabric turned red almost immediately, but the bleeding seemed to slow. Mason's hands were shaking now, adrenaline catching up with him, the full weight of what was happening finally breaking through his shock. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder. The ambulance was coming. Help was coming. Mason glanced at his watch, the automatic gesture of someone who'd been checking time obsessively for hours. 2:29. His meeting had started 4 minutes ago. Right now, the Hoffmans were probably sitting in the conference room at the social services office, waiting. Ms. Rivera would be checking her phone, trying to call Mason, getting no answer because his phone was back at the shelter charging. In another minute, maybe 2, she'd start apologizing to the Hoffmans. Start explaining that sometimes kids get cold feet, that Mason must have changed his mind, that she was so sorry for wasting their time. Another failed placement. Another rejection. Another confirmation that Mason was the kind of kid nobody wanted. He could still go. The thought pushed its way into his consciousness like an unwelcome guest. The ambulance was coming. These people could take over. Vic was breathing. Iris was out from under the bike. Mason had done his part. He could run 6 blocks in maybe 4 minutes if he sprinted. Could arrive sweaty and disheveled and covered in someone else's blood, but he could arrive. Could try to explain. Could beg for another chance. Someone else could stay with Iris, and Vic someone else could wait for the paramedics. Someone else could handle this. But then Iris's small hand wrapped around his wrist again, and when Mason looked down, those brown eyes were locked on his face with an intensity that made his chest ache. "Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice small and broken and terrified. "You promised you wouldn't leave me." And she was right. He had promised. When he'd pulled her from under that bike, when he'd wrapped her ankle, when he'd told her everything would be okay, he'd made a promise. Maybe not in those exact words, but the promise was there all the same. Mason looked at his watch one more time. His caseworker would be calling the Hoffmans any minute, explaining his absence, apologizing for wasting their time. Another failed chance. Another rejection. But Mason made a promise to a terrified little girl, and in his entire life, nobody had ever kept their promises to him. He wasn't about to become another person who breaks them. If you think Mason made the right choice, comment "real hero." If you think people who help strangers deserve good things in return, smash that like button. Let's show the algorithm what real character looks like. The ambulance arrived at 2:34, sirens screaming through the intersection, scattering the crowd of onlookers who'd gathered to watch the tragedy unfold. 2 paramedics jumped out, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd seen this before, who knew exactly what to do when the world fell apart. The first paramedic, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, went straight to Vic. The second, a younger man with kind eyes, knelt beside Iris. Mason stepped back to give them room, but Iris's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with desperate strength. "No, don't leave me. Mason, don't go." The paramedic looked at Mason, then at Iris's terrified face, and made a quick decision. "You family." "No, I was here when it happened. I helped get her out." "Well, she wants you with her. You okay riding to the hospital?" Mason nodded, unable to speak, and climbed into the back of the ambulance behind the stretcher where they'd secured Iris. She held his hand the entire ride, her small fingers wrapped around his, her eyes never leaving his face. The paramedic worked quickly, checking her vitals, stabilizing her ankle, asking her questions to assess for head injury or internal bleeding. In the front of the ambulance, separated by a partition, the other paramedic worked on Vic. Mason could hear the urgent murmur of medical terminology, the beeping of monitors, the controlled urgency in the woman's voice as she radioed ahead to the hospital. Vic regained consciousness somewhere between the accident scene and the emergency room. Mason heard him groan, heard him say something that sounded like "Iris," his voice thick and confused. "Daddy." Iris tried to sit up, but the straps held her down. "Daddy, I'm okay." Through the partition, Mason could see Vic's face, pale and blood-smeared, his eyes struggling to focus. The older man's gaze landed on Mason, confusion evident in his expression. "Who are you?" Vic asked, the words slurred. Where's my daughter?" "She's right here, sir," Mason said. "She's okay. You're both going to be okay." Vic's eyes rolled back, and he lost consciousness again before he could respond. The emergency room was controlled chaos. Iris was wheeled immediately to radiology for x-rays of her ankle. Vic was rushed to trauma surgery, doctors barking orders about CT scans and possible intracranial bleeding. And Mason was left standing in the middle of it all, shirtless and covered in blood that wasn't his, watching the organized machinery of emergency medicine swallow up the 2 people he'd spent the last 12 minutes trying to save. A nurse appeared at his elbow, gentle but efficient. "Honey, are you hurt?" Mason looked down at himself. Blood covered his hands, his arms, his chest. Vic's blood from the head wound. Dirt and grime from the street. His borrowed shirt was gone, torn into strips and wrapped around Iris's ankle, probably sitting in a biohazard bag somewhere now. "No," Mason said. "It's not my blood. Come with me. Let's get you cleaned up." She led him to a bathroom in the emergency department, gave him a hospital gown to wear, and showed him where the soap was. Then she left him alone. Mason stood at the sink and turned on the water. It ran red as he scrubbed at his hands, trying to get Vic's blood out from under his fingernails, out of the creases in his palms, off his wrists and forearms. The water was warm, but he couldn't feel it. Couldn't feel much of anything except a growing, crushing realization of what he'd done. His reflection in the mirror was a stranger. Pale, hollow-eyed, dirt smudged across his cheek, hair standing up in all directions. This wasn't the boy who was supposed to meet the Hoffmans. This wasn't the presentable, mature, choosable kid who'd spent 6 days preparing for the most important meeting of his life. Mason checked his watch. 3:15. His meeting had been over for 45 minutes. He pulled out his phone, miraculously still in his pocket, though the screen was cracked, and called the social services office. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. The automated message informed him that office hours were 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. Please leave a message after the tone. Mason hung up and dialed Ms. Rivera's cell phone instead. It rang 6 times. Voicemail again. Her voice, professional and warm. You've reached Diana Rivera with Child Protective Services. I'm unable to take your call right now, but please leave a detailed message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. The beep sounded like a death knell. MS. Rivera, it's Mason. I'm so sorry. There was an accident and I couldn't make it to the meeting. I'm at Mercy Hospital. I'm okay, but I couldn't make it. I'm so sorry. Please call me back. He hung up and stared at the phone, willing it to ring. It didn't. Mason would learn later that Ms. Rivera had waited in that conference room with the Hoffmans until 3:30. That she'd tried calling the shelter at 2:45 when Mason still hadn't shown. That she'd apologized profusely to the Hoffmans, explaining that Mason was usually so reliable, that this was completely out of character. That the Hoffmans had been understanding but firm. They couldn't adopt a child who didn't take the process seriously. That Ms. Rivera had driven to the shelter personally at 4 o'clock, her heart breaking, ready to have a difficult conversation with Mason about responsibility and consequences. That she'd found his phone charging on his bunk and understood something had gone terribly wrong. But Mason didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that he'd destroyed his only chance at a family, and he couldn't even explain why. A knock on the bathroom door. You okay in there, son? Mason pulled on the hospital gown and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was a man who looked like he'd stepped out of every stereotype about motorcycle gangs. 6'2", barrel-chested, arms covered in tattoos. A leather vest with Hell's Angels patches. A beard that reached mid-chest. A face that had seen violence and come out the other side. This was Leon, though Mason didn't know his name yet. Iris's uncle, Vic's second-in-command, and the first person the hospital had called from Vic's emergency contacts. Leon's eyes swept over Mason, taking in the hospital gown, the blood still visible on Mason's arms despite the scrubbing, the exhaustion written into every line of the boy's face. You the kid who helped Iris? Mason nodded, suddenly nervous. This man could break him in half without trying. Hospital said some 12-year-old pulled her out from under Vic's bike. That you? Yes, sir. What happened? Mason explained as best he could. The black SUV running the light. The collision. Vic thrown clear. Iris trapped. The lever and the car jack. Getting her out. Staying with both of them until the ambulance came. Leon listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. And you are? Nobody, Mason said automatically. I'm nobody. I just happened to be there. You got a name, nobody? Mason. Mason what? Just Mason. No last name that matters. Leon's eyes narrowed slightly, the look of someone putting pieces together. You got parents? Someone we should call. No, sir. I was heading to. It doesn't matter. How is Iris? Is she going to be okay? Something shifted in Leon's expression. The suspicion didn't disappear completely, but it softened around the edges. You stayed with her? After you got her out? She asked me to. She asked you to. Yes, sir. Leon was quiet for a long moment, studying Mason with an intensity that made the boy want to disappear. Then, doctor says Iris has a fractured ankle. Clean break. Should heal fine with a cast. Vic's got a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, and they're keeping him for observation because of the head injury. But he's stable. They're both going to be okay. The relief that washed over Mason was so intense it made his knees weak. Thank God. Thank you, Leon said. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't pulled her out. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, Leon said flatly. They wouldn't have. I saw the video. What video? Someone filmed it. Whole thing's already online. Bunch of people standing around watching, filming with their phones. You were the only one who moved. The only one who helped. Leon paused. Where do you need to go, Mason? Where's home? Home. What a word. What a concept. The shelter on Grand Street, Mason said quietly. That's where I stay. Leon's expression shifted again, something like understanding crossing his face. You're in the system. Yes, sir. And you don't have anybody. No, sir. But you had somewhere to be. You said you were heading somewhere when this happened. Mason's throat tightened. It doesn't matter now. It matters to me. I had a meeting. An adoption meeting. First one I've ever had. I missed it to help Iris. The silence that followed was heavy, weighted with implications Mason was too tired to fully process. Leon stared at him for what felt like an eternity, then pulled out his phone and typed something quickly. Mason saw the screen light up with responses almost immediately, the rapid-fire buzz of incoming messages. Come on, Leon said finally. I'll give you a ride back to your shelter. They walked through the hospital corridors, an odd pair, the massive biker and the skinny 12-year-old in a hospital gown. Leon stopped at the nurse's station and got an update on Vic and Iris. Both stable, both resting. Iris was asking for the boy who'd helped her. Vic was still unconscious, but his vitals were improving. Tell Iris I said goodbye, Mason said. Tell her I hope she feels better. In the parking lot, Leon's motorcycle sat next to a row of cars. He pulled a spare jacket from his saddlebag and handed it to Mason. Put this on. You can't ride home in a hospital gown. The jacket was enormous, leather and worn, smelling like smoke and engine oil. Mason pulled it on, the hem reaching his knees. Leon climbed onto the bike and gestured for Mason to get on behind him. Mason had never been on a motorcycle before. The engine rumbled to life beneath them, powerful and loud, and then they were moving through the city streets as evening settled over the buildings. They rode in silence. Mason held onto the back of the seat, watching the city slide past, every mile marker a reminder of how far he was from where he was supposed to be. When they pulled up in front of the Grand Street shelter, the sun was low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. Mason climbed off the bike and handed back the jacket. Thank you, sir, for the ride. Mason, Leon said. What's your full name? Mason Porter. Mason Porter. I won't forget it. He reached into his vest and pulled out a card, plain white with a phone number written in black ink. You need anything, you call this number. You understand? Anything at all. Mason took the card, confused. Why? Because you saved Vic's daughter. Because you stayed when you didn't have to. Because you gave up something important to help strangers. Leon's expression was serious. The Hells Angels don't forget that kind of thing. Then he kicked the bike into gear and rode away, the engine's roar fading into the distance. Mason stood on the sidewalk, holding the card, watching until the motorcycle disappeared around a corner. Then he turned and walked into the shelter, back to his bunk, back to his bin of belongings, back to the life he'd tried so desperately to escape. Mason had no idea that Leon was already texting the entire charter, that dozens of bikers were already reading about the homeless kid who saved Vic's little girl, that a plan was already forming. But all Mason knew in this moment was that he'd traded his future for a stranger's life, and he'd do it again in a heartbeat, even if it meant spending the rest of his childhood alone. The Hells Angels have 3 rules: protect the charter, protect the innocent, and never forget someone who bleeds for your family. Mason was about to learn that in the most overwhelming way possible. The shelter's fluorescent lights felt harsh after the soft glow of dusk outside. Mason walked through the front door at 8:47 in the evening, still wearing Leon's enormous leather jacket, his legs and feet bare beneath it. The common room was mostly empty at this hour, just a few residents watching television with the volume turned low. The shelter director, Mr. Kowalski, looked up from his desk near the entrance, and the relief on his face immediately transformed into concern. Mason, he said, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the linoleum. Where have you been? Your caseworker has been calling all afternoon. She's beside herself. Mason opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The words were stuck somewhere in his chest, tangled up with exhaustion and grief and a crushing weight he couldn't name. He just stood there, swaying slightly, looking at Mr. Kowalski with eyes that had seen too much in the past 6 hours. Mr. Kowalski's expression softened. He was in his 60s, a former social worker who'd spent the last decade running the Grand Street shelter with a combination of firm rules and genuine compassion. He'd seen a lot of broken kids walk through these doors, but something about Mason's face in this moment seemed to shake him. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. Mason shook his head. "Do you need medical attention?" Another head shake. "Okay, go to your bunk. I'll let Ms. Rivera know you're back safe. We'll talk about this tomorrow." Mason nodded and walked toward the sleeping area on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The other boys were getting ready for bed. The usual evening routine of teeth brushing and changing into pajamas and arguing over who got to use the bathroom first. A few of them looked at Mason as he passed, noticed the oversized leather jacket, the hospital bracelet still on his wrist, the hollow look in his eyes. But nobody asked questions. That was the unspoken rule in places like this. Everyone had their own trauma, their own bad days, their own reasons for looking like they'd been through hell. You didn't pry. Mason climbed up to his bunk and lay down on top of the thin blanket, still wearing the jacket. His phone sat on the small shelf next to his pillow, the screen dark. When he picked it up, it showed 5 missed calls, all from Ms. Rivera. 3 voicemails, 2 text messages. He couldn't listen to them yet. Couldn't read them. His thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment before he set the phone back down. The shelter settled into its nighttime rhythm around him. Lights dimmed at 9 o'clock. The television in the common room went silent. Mr. Kowalski made his final rounds, checking that all 15 boys were accounted for and in their beds. The old building creaked and groaned the way old buildings do, settling into the coolness of evening. At 9:15, Mason finally picked up his phone and called Ms. Rivera back. She answered on the first ring. "Mason? Oh, thank God. Are you okay? Where were you?" "I'm okay," Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm at the shelter. I'm safe." "Mason, what happened?" There was something in her voice he'd never heard before. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. Disappointment, maybe. Frustration. "The Hoffmans waited for you. I waited for you. When you didn't show up, I called the shelter and Mr. Kowalski said you'd left hours earlier. I've been terrified all afternoon thinking something happened to you. Something did happen. There was an accident and... Mason, I need you to understand how serious this is. The Hoffmans waited for 40 minutes. 40 minutes. They were understanding about it. Said maybe you got cold feet, that it happens sometimes with older kids. But they were very clear. They can't adopt a child who doesn't take the process seriously. They've moved on. They're meeting with another child next week." The words hit Mason like physical blows, each one landing in his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. "I'm sorry," he managed. "I know I messed up. This wasn't like you, Mason. You're one of the most reliable kids I work with. You've never missed a meeting, never been late for anything. What happened? And don't tell me you got cold feet, because I know that's not true. You've been preparing for this for weeks." Mason closed his eyes. He could explain. Could tell her about Iris and Vic and the accident and the impossible choice he'd made. Could make her understand that he hadn't abandoned the meeting out of fear or indifference, but because a 7-year-old girl was trapped under a motorcycle and needed help. But what good would it do? The Hoffmans were gone. That chance was gone. And explaining wouldn't bring it back. "I'm sorry," Mason said again. "I know I let you down." "Mason, it's not just about letting me down. I had 3 other families who'd expressed interest in meeting you next month. 3 families who were waiting to see how today went. When I called to tell them you'd missed the meeting with the Hoffmans, they all pulled back. They think you're not committed to the process. They think you're not ready for adoption." The room spun slightly. Mason gripped the edge of his bunk to steady himself. "I understand," he said, because what else was there to say? "Do you? Do you understand that you might have just ruined your best chance at finding a permanent home? Mason, you're 12. In 6 years you'll age out of the system. 6 years to find a family. And opportunities like this don't come along every day. I know. I'm sorry. Stop saying you're sorry and tell me what happened." The desperation in her voice almost broke him. Ms. Rivera cared. He knew that. She'd fought for him, advocated for him, never given up on him even when other caseworkers might have written him off as too old, too quiet, too damaged. She deserved an explanation. But Mason was so tired. So bone-deep exhausted that forming words felt like climbing a mountain. "There was an accident," he said finally. "A little girl got hurt. I helped. By the time the ambulance came, it was too late to make the meeting. I'm sorry. I have to go now." He hung up before she could respond, before she could ask more questions or express more disappointment or make him feel worse than he already did. The bunk below him creaked as the boy who slept there shifted position. Somewhere in the shelter, someone coughed. A siren wailed in the distance, heading towards some other emergency, some other crisis. The city never stopped bleeding, never stopped breaking, never stopped needing help. Mason lay on his back and stared at the ceiling, at the water stains that looked like continents on a map to nowhere. His journal sat on the shelf next to his phone, the spiral-bound notebook where he'd practiced his introduction so many times it should have been perfect. He reached for it, found a pen, and wrote by the dim glow of the emergency exit sign. I saved someone today. I lost everything. I think I made the right choice. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore. The other boys in the room were mostly asleep now, their breathing settling into the steady rhythm of unconsciousness. Mason envied them, envied their ability to escape into dreams, to leave their problems behind for a few hours. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Iris's face. Those terrified brown eyes looking up at him from under 800 pounds of steel, her small hand gripping his wrist, her voice, broken and desperate. Please don't leave me. Please. He couldn't have left her. The thought was impossible, incomprehensible. Even knowing what it would cost him, even knowing he was throwing away his only chance at a family, he couldn't have walked away from that little girl and lived with himself. Mason had spent 12 years being nobody, being the kid who didn't get chosen, who wasn't quite right, who was too quiet or too old or too something. He'd spent 12 years feeling invisible, watching other children get adopted while he remained behind, wondering what was wrong with him that nobody wanted him. But today, for 6 hours, he'd been somebody. He'd been the person who stayed, who helped, who kept a promise to a scared little girl who needed him. Was that worth losing his future over? Mason didn't know. He honestly didn't know. But when he thought about the alternative, when he imagined himself walking away from Iris to make his meeting, imagined leaving her trapped and terrified while he pursued his own interests, his stomach turned. That person, the one who could make that choice, wasn't someone Mason wanted to be. Maybe that's why nobody adopted him. Maybe they could see something in him, some fundamental flaw that made him unsuitable for normal family life. Or maybe he'd just finally, catastrophically, run out of luck. In his pocket, folded into a small square, was a torn piece of paper he'd picked up from the street before climbing into the ambulance. Part of his adoption letter from the Hoffmans, the only piece that hadn't blown away. The words, "Pleased to inform you," were still visible, though the rest was torn away. Mason pulled it out and held it in his palm, this fragment of a future that would never happen. He started to cry. Quietly, so the other boys wouldn't hear. Tears running down his face and soaking into the pillow that smelled like industrial detergent. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, his chest aching with a grief that had no outlet, no resolution. I couldn't leave her, he thought, even if it meant staying here forever, even if it meant never finding a family. I couldn't leave her. Mason fell asleep still clutching that torn piece of paper, his face wet with tears, his body curled into a protective ball under Leon's borrowed leather jacket. He fell asleep believing he destroyed his only chance at a family. He fell asleep thinking that this was his life now. This was his future, the Grand Street shelter until he aged out. Then whatever came after, the uncertain fate of kids who never got chosen. What he didn't know was that across the city, in a hospital room at Mercy Medical Center, Iris was sitting up in her bed with a bright pink cast on her ankle, telling her father everything. Telling him about the boy named Mason who'd pulled her out from under the motorcycle, who'd stayed with her even though he had somewhere important to be, who'd promised not to leave her and kept that promise. And Vic Brennan, president of the Hells Angels Charter, lying in his hospital bed with bandages wrapped around his head and his ribs screaming with every breath, was listening to his daughter with an intensity that made the nurses nervous. When Iris finished her story, when she said for the third time, "Daddy, he saved me. Mason saved me," Vic had picked up his phone and sent a single text message to Leon. Find out everything about the kid named Mason. Everything. By morning, 53 bikers would know Mason's full story. They'd know about the shelter and the system and the 12 years of rejection. They'd know about the adoption meeting he'd missed to save Iris. They'd know about a boy who chose a stranger's child over his own future. And they were about to make a decision that would change everything. If you believe good deeds should be rewarded, you need to stay for what happens next. Comment justice for Mason if you think this kid deserves a miracle. And if you believe that real family is built on loyalty, not paperwork. Hit that subscribe button right now. Mason woke to a sound he'd never heard before, not in 3 years at the Grand Street shelter, not in 12 years of bouncing through the system. The deep, rumbling thunder of engines. Dozens of them, maybe more. The sound vibrated through the building's walls, through the windows, through the metal frame of his bunk bed until he could feel it in his bones. He sat up, disoriented, still wearing Leon's leather jacket. The clock on the wall read 6:47 in the morning. Around him, other boys were stirring, confused voices cutting through the engine noise. What is that? Sounds like motorcycles. Who the hell is making that much noise this early? Then came the rush to the windows. 10 boys scrambling across bunks, pressing their faces to the glass, trying to see what was happening outside. Mason climbed down from his bunk slowly, his body stiff and sore from yesterday's exertions, and joined them at the windows. The sight stopped his heart. Motorcycles. Everywhere. Lining both sides of the street, parked in clusters on the sidewalk, filling the small parking lot beside the shelter. Mason counted 15, then 20, then gave up counting because they kept coming. More bikes rumbling down the street, pulling into formation, engines cutting off one by one until the morning went quiet except for the settling tick of cooling metal. Bikers dismounted. Big men in leather vests covered with patches, some with beards down to their chests, some with arms completely sleeved in tattoos. All of them wearing the same colors, the same insignia, Hell's Angels. Holy crap, breathed the boy next to Mason, a 14-year-old named Felix. That's like 50 bikes. What are they doing here? Another boy asked. Maybe they're here to donate or something, someone suggested. Don't biker clubs do charity stuff? But Mason's eyes had found someone in the crowd, and his blood ran cold. Vic Brennan stood at the front of the group, unmistakable even with the white bandage wrapped around his head. He moved stiffly, clearly in pain, one arm wrapped around his ribs. And beside him, holding his hand, was Iris. She was on crutches, her right leg extended in front of her, the cast bright pink and already covered with signatures. She wore the same miniature leather jacket from yesterday, and despite everything, she was smiling. They were here, at his shelter, looking for something, looking for someone, looking for him. Mason's stomach dropped. They're angry, his mind supplied immediately. I must have done something wrong. Maybe I hurt Iris worse than I thought when I pulled her out. Maybe Vic is mad that I touched his daughter. Maybe they think I'm responsible for the accident somehow. Maybe. Mr. Kowalski appeared in the sleeping area, his face tight with concern. Everyone away from the windows. Back to your bunks. Now. But Mr. K, what's happening? Who are all those bikers? Are we in trouble? Nobody is in trouble. Just stay inside and let me handle this. Mr. Kowalski's voice was firm, but Mason could hear the nervousness underneath. The shelter director was a good man, but he was 63 years old and maybe 150 pounds soaking wet. The idea of him handling 50 Hell's Angels members would have been funny under different circumstances. The boys reluctantly moved away from the windows, but nobody went back to their bunks. They clustered in small groups, whispering, speculating. Mason stood frozen in place, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Through the window, he watched Mr. Kowalski walk outside, squaring his shoulders in a visible attempt at authority. The man looked tiny, standing in front of that wall of leather and chrome and testosterone. Gentlemen, Mr. Kowalski said, his voice carrying through the morning air, this is a shelter for children. I'm going to have to ask you to. Vic Brennan stepped forward, cutting him off. His voice was gravelly, rough from injury or pain or both. We're looking for a boy named Mason. About 12 years old. Probably still has our blood on his clothes. Mason's heart stopped completely. Felix turned to look at him, eyes wide. Mason, dude, what did you do? I don't know, Mason whispered. I don't know. But he did know, didn't he? He'd helped at the accident. He'd pulled Iris out. He'd stayed when he wasn't supposed to. He'd inserted himself into their lives uninvited. And now they were here to what? Confront him? Blame him? Make him pay for something? Is the child in trouble? Mr. Kowalski asked, and Mason could hear the protective edge in his voice. Whatever else the shelter director might be, he cared about his kids. Vic's response was hidden behind the thick walls, but Mason saw Mr. Kowalski's posture shift slightly, saw confusion cross the man's face. That depends, Vic said, his voice loud enough now that it carried through the glass. Is he here? The pause that followed felt eternal. Mason couldn't move, couldn't think, could barely breathe. Every eye in the sleeping area had turned to him. Felix's hand on his shoulder. Another boy whispering, "Mason, what's going on?" Then Vic's voice again, and this time Mason heard every word with perfect clarity. "Because if he is, we need to thank him for saving my daughter's life." The words didn't make sense. Mason's brain tried to process them, tried to fit them into his understanding of the world, and failed completely. Thank him? They wanted to thank him? No way. Felix breathed. "Mason, did you save that little girl?" Mason couldn't answer, couldn't move. His entire body had locked up, frozen in place by a confusion so complete it bordered on paralysis. This didn't happen. People didn't show up for him. People didn't come looking for him. People didn't thank him for anything because people didn't notice him at all. But through the window, he could see Iris now, hopping forward on her crutches to stand next to her father. She was looking at the shelter, her eyes scanning the windows like she was searching for something. Searching for someone. Searching for him. Mason couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was hearing. Because in his entire life, nobody had ever shown up for him. Nobody had ever come looking for him. And now 50 bikers were standing outside his shelter, and Mason had absolutely no idea that in the next 60 seconds, his entire life was about to be rewritten. But before we get to the moment that changes everything, you need to understand what happened in that hospital room last night. Because when Iris finally told her father the full story, when she explained that Mason missed something important to save her life, Vic made a phone call that set this entire morning in motion. Mr. Kowalski came back inside, his face unreadable, a complicated mix of emotions Mason couldn't parse. The shelter director walked straight to where Mason stood frozen among the other boys. All of them still crowded around the windows, watching the scene outside like it was something from a movie. "Mason," Mr. Kowalski said gently, "someone here to see you." "Am I in trouble?" The words came out small, childlike. "No, son. I don't think you're in trouble at all." "Mr." Kowalski's expression softened into something that might have been wonder. "Come on. They're waiting." Mason's legs didn't want to move. His body had gone into some kind of protective shutdown, every instinct screaming at him to hide, to disappear, to become invisible the way he'd learned to do so well over 12 years in the system. But Mr. Kowalski's hand was gentle on his shoulder, guiding him forward, and somehow Mason found himself walking down the stairs, through the common room where the television was still dark, past the office where he'd received the adoption letter just 6 days ago, back when the world made sense, toward the glass doors that led outside, where 50 Hell's Angels members waited in the early morning light. Mason could see them all now, row after row of leather vests and tattooed arms and faces that had seen hard miles. Big men on big motorcycles, the kind of people who made regular citizens cross the street to avoid them. The kind of people who lived in a world Mason had only glimpsed through movies and news reports. Dangerous people, his brain supplied. Scary people. But Iris was there, and she wasn't scared. Mr. Kowalski opened the door, and Mason stepped outside into the cool morning air. The sound of his sneakers on the concrete steps seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. 50 pairs of eyes turned to look at him. Mason wanted to run. Wanted to bolt back inside and hide in his bunk and pretend this wasn't happening. Instead, he took another step forward. Then another. Vic Brennan moved to meet him, separating from the group with Iris still holding his hand. Up close, the man looked worse than he had yesterday. The bandage around his head was clean but bulky, covering what Mason knew was a serious wound. He moved like every step hurt, his free hand pressed against his ribs, his face pale beneath the weathered tan. But his eyes were clear, focused intently on Mason. "You Mason?" Vic's voice was rough, gravelly, but not unkind. Mason nodded. His voice had abandoned him completely. Vic lowered himself to one knee with visible effort, a small grimace crossing his face as the movement pulled at his injured ribs. But he did it anyway, bringing himself down to Mason's eye level. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "My daughter tells me you saved her life yesterday." "Hi, Mason." Iris waved enthusiastically from beside her father, her crutches tucked under her arms, her pink cast bright in the morning sun. "I told Daddy everything, about how you pulled me out and wrapped my ankle and stayed with me even though you had to go somewhere important." Mason found his voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Is she okay? I tried to be careful with her ankle, but I didn't really know what I was doing. and I was worried I made it worse when I pulled her out. She's perfect, Vic interrupted gently. Fractured ankle, clean break. Doctors said it'll heal completely. She'll be back to ballet in a few months. He paused, studying Mason's face. Thanks to you. I'm just glad she's okay. Iris also told me you missed something important yesterday. Something about an adoption meeting. Mason's eyes dropped to the ground. The concrete was cracked, weeds pushing through in stubborn defiance. He focused on those weeds like they were the most fascinating things in the world. It's okay, Mason said. It wasn't your fault. The accident wasn't your fault. Leon did some calling around last night, Vic continued. Talked to your caseworker, Ms. Rivera. Found out what that meeting meant to you. Your first real chance at a family. Mason's throat tightened. He didn't want to talk about this. Didn't want to think about the Hoffmans, or the conference room, or the future that had slipped away while he held Iris's hand in the back of an ambulance. Really, it's fine. I made a choice. I knew what I was doing. Did you? Vic asked, and there was something in his voice that made Mason look up. You're 12 years old, Mason. You made an impossible choice, and you chose to save my daughter instead of going to your meeting. That's not fine. That's extraordinary. Vic stood up slowly, pain evident in every movement, and turned to address the gathered bikers. His voice carried across the parking lot, strong despite his injuries. Brothers, he said, this is Mason, 12 years old, been in the system his whole life. Yesterday he had his first real shot at a family, his first adoption meeting, and he gave it up to save my daughter. He pulled her out from under my bike, stayed with her even though it cost him everything. Made her a promise and kept it, even when keeping that promise meant destroying his own future. The silence that followed was absolute. 50 bikers, men who looked like they'd seen and done things most people couldn't imagine, stood completely still. Mason could feel the weight of their attention, could feel something shifting in the air around him. Then one biker started clapping. A man near the back, older, with gray in his beard. Slow, deliberate claps that echoed off the shelter's walls. Another joined in. Then another. Then suddenly all of them were clapping, this thunder of applause that rose and swelled until it seemed to shake the morning itself. Some of them whistled. Some of them called out affirmations Mason couldn't quite make out over the noise. It was too much. The attention, the validation, the sheer overwhelming reality that 50 people were applauding him for something he'd done. Mason felt his eyes burn, felt tears spilling over before he could stop them. He tried to wipe them away quickly, embarrassed, but they kept coming. Nobody laughed. Nobody told him to toughen up or be a man or stop crying. They just kept clapping, kept showing him that what he'd done mattered, that he mattered. Vic raised his hand and the applause died away, leaving just the morning sounds of the city waking up. Birds singing, distant traffic, the settling tick of cooling motorcycle engines. Mason, Vic said, I can't give you those people back. I can't undo what happened yesterday or get you that meeting with the Hoffmans, but I can give you something else. Mason wiped at his eyes with the sleeve of Leon's borrowed jacket. You don't have to give me anything. I just wanted to help. That's all. I know you did. And that's exactly why we're here. Vic glanced back at the assembled bikers, then returned his attention to Mason. You know what the Hells Angels are? A motorcycle club, Mason said carefully, not sure what answer was expected. We're a brotherhood, Vic corrected. We're a family. Not the kind that shares blood, but the kind that shares loyalty. The kind that shows up when it matters. The kind that protects its own and never forgets when someone bleeds for them. Mason had no idea where this was going. His heart was hammering again. That familiar anxiety that came from not understanding what adults wanted from him, not knowing what the right response was supposed to be. Yesterday, Vic continued, you bled for my family. You sacrificed for my daughter. And the Hells Angels don't forget that kind of thing. We talked last night, my charter brothers and I, talked about you, about what you did, about what you lost. And we made some decisions. Leon stepped forward from the crowd, the same massive biker who'd given Mason a ride yesterday. He was carrying something, Mason realized. A folder. Paperwork. We made some calls, Leon said, his deep voice rumbling. Called lawyers, called social workers we know, called in favors from people who owe us. Pulled a lot of strings very fast. Mason looked between Vic and Leon, completely lost. I don't understand. Vic exchanged a glance with Iris, who smiled up at her father with absolute trust and love. Then he looked back at Mason. Mason, my daughter is the most important thing in my world. You understand that. Mason nodded. When someone protects her the way you did, when someone puts her life before their own interests, that makes them family in my book. That makes them worth protecting in return. I still don't understand what you're saying. Vic took a breath, and Mason saw something in his expression shift. Vulnerability, maybe, or hope, or determination. Maybe all three at once. I'm a single dad, Vic said. Lost my wife 3 years ago to cancer. Been raising Iris alone ever since, with help from my brothers in the club. It's not always easy. It's not conventional, but we make it work. The morning seemed to hold its breath. Even the birds had gone quiet. I'd like you to come live with us, Vic said. Officially. I'm starting the process to become your foster parent, with the goal of adoption if it works out. If you want it. If you're willing to take a chance on a biker dad and a little sister who already thinks you hung the moon. The words didn't compute. Mason's brain tried to process them, tried to fit them into his understanding of how the world worked, and failed completely. This didn't happen. People didn't just show up and offer to adopt you. Especially not people you'd known for less than 24 hours. Especially not after you destroyed your one real chance at a normal family. I don't. Mason started, then stopped. You want to adopt me? I want to give you what you gave my daughter, Vic said. A chance. A real one. You need a family, Mason. And Iris needs a big brother who'll actually protect her, not just tolerate her. Someone who's already proven he'll put her first when it matters. Iris hopped forward on her crutches, her face bright with excitement. Please say yes, Mason. We have an extra bedroom and Daddy makes really good pancakes, even though he always burns the edges. And you can help me practice my ballet moves when my ankle heals. And we have a dog. Well, not yet, but Daddy said we could get one if you come live with us, didn't you, Daddy? I said we'd talk about it, Vic corrected, but he was smiling. Mason couldn't speak, couldn't move. Couldn't do anything but stand there with tears running down his face, staring at this man who'd just offered him the thing he'd wanted his entire life. A family, a home, a place to belong. Mason had no idea what Vic was about to say next. Had no idea that the conversation he was about to hear would split his life into before and after. Had no idea that the Hells Angels had spent the entire night making phone calls, pulling strings, and preparing an offer that would change everything. But in this moment, standing in the morning light surrounded by 50 bikers who'd shown up to thank him, with Iris smiling and Vic waiting patiently for an answer, Mason began to understand that maybe, just maybe, destroying his chance with the Hoffmans wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was just the beginning. Vic watched Mason process the offer, watched the boy's face cycle through disbelief and confusion and something that looked dangerously like hope. He let the silence stretch, understanding that some moments needed space to breathe, that pushing too hard would only make the boy retreat further into himself. Finally, Vic spoke again, his voice low and steady. Mason, my daughter is the most important thing in my world. You understand that? Mason nodded slowly, his eyes still wet with tears he was trying unsuccessfully to hide. When someone protects her, Vic continued, when someone puts her safety above their own future, they protect everything I love. Everything that matters to me. That makes you family in my book. That makes you someone worth protecting in return. I don't understand, Mason whispered. I just did what anyone would do. No, Vic said firmly. You didn't. Anyone else would have kept walking, would have called 911 and moved on with their day, would have prioritized their own meeting over a stranger's emergency. But you didn't. You stayed. You fought to get her free. You held her hand and promised you wouldn't leave, and then you kept that promise even when it destroyed your chance at a family. Leon stepped forward, the folder still tucked under his massive arm. His expression had softened from the gruff suspicion of yesterday into something approaching respect. Last night, Vic said, while I was lying in that hospital bed with my head split open and my ribs screaming, Iris told me everything. Told me about the boy who saved her. Told me you missed something important to stay with her. So I called my lawyer at 9 o'clock at night and woke him up. Then I called a friend of mine who works in social services, someone who understands how the system works. Then I called Leon and asked him to gather the charter because I needed my brothers to weigh in on a decision. Leon's voice rumbled out, surprisingly gentle for a man his size. We voted Mason, all 53 members of this charter. Took us about 30 seconds. Unanimous. Mason looked between them, completely lost. Voted on what? Vic took a breath, and when he spoke again, there was emotion thick in his voice. I'm a single dad. Lost my wife, Elena, 3 years ago. Cancer took her after an 18-month fight that near destroyed both of us. Since then, it's just been me and Iris, trying to figure out how to be a family when half of us is missing. The club has helped raise her. She's got 50 uncles who die for her. But it's not the same as having a mom. It's not the same as having a complete family. He paused, his hand resting on Iris's shoulder. She looked up at him with absolute trust, this little girl who'd already lost so much, but still believed in happy endings. It's not always easy, Vic continued. Being raised by a biker isn't like being raised in a normal suburban home. Iris goes to clubhouse barbecues where grown men curse and drink beer. She's learning to change motorcycle oil before she can do long division. Her bedroom is in a house where my Harley sits in the living room half the time because I'm rebuilding the engine. We're not conventional. We're not what most people picture when they think about the perfect family. But we make it work, Iris chimed in. And we're happy. Mostly. Except I wish I had a brother. I've been asking Daddy for a brother for forever. Vic smiled down at her, then looked back at Mason. I'd like you to come live with us. Officially. I'm starting the process to become your foster parent, with the goal of adoption if things work out. If you want that. If you're willing to take a chance on us. The words hung in the morning air like something solid. Something Rael Mason could almost reach out and touch. But touching meant risk. Touching meant hope. And hope was the most dangerous thing a kid in the system could allow himself to feel. You want to adopt me? Mason said, not quite a question, more like he was testing the words to see if they were real. I want to give you what you gave my daughter, Vic said. A chance. A real one. Not some meeting with strangers who know you from a file. Not some placement that might last a week or a month before they decide you're not what they wanted. I'm talking about a home. A family. People who show up and stay, who don't leave when things get hard. Mason's mouth opened, but no words came out. His brain was screaming contradictions at him. This is too good to be true. This doesn't happen to kids like you. There's a catch. There's always a catch. People don't just offer to adopt you after knowing you for one day. This is insane. I know I'm not the family you pictured, Vic said, reading something in Mason's expression. I know you probably imagined a mom and a dad with a nice house and a golden retriever named something like Biscuit. I know we're not that. I'm a biker, a single dad, president of a motorcycle club that most people cross the street to avoid. I've got a record, Mason. Nothing violent, nothing I'm ashamed of, but it's there. I'm not perfect. He gestured to the assembled bikers behind him. These men aren't perfect either, but they're loyal. They're honest. They protect their own. And if you become part of my family, you become part of theirs too. That means 50 men who'll teach you how to fix an engine and throw a punch and stand up for yourself. It means 50 men who'll show up when you need them, who'll have your back no matter what. I don't know anything about motorcycles, Mason said, his voice small. We'll teach you. We'll teach you everything you need to know. I don't know how to be part of a family. Neither did I when Iris was born, Vic said. Elena had to teach me. We learned together. We messed up a lot. We figured it out as we went. That's what families do, Mason. They figure it out together. Iris shifted on her crutches and looked up at Mason with those same brown eyes that had locked onto his yesterday, that had begged him not to leave. Please say yes, Mason. We have an extra bedroom, and it's got a window that looks out at the park. And Daddy makes really good pancakes, even though he always burns the bacon. And you can help me with my crutches until my ankle heals. And then you can come watch my ballet recital in December. And we can play video games. Do you like video games? I'm really good at Mario Kart. Mason looked at this 7-year-old girl, this bright spark of life who'd been trapped under 800 pounds of steel less than 24 hours ago, and felt something crack open in his chest. She was okay. She was standing here smiling and excited and full of hope, and Mason had helped make that possible. Iris needs a big brother who'll actually protect her, not just tolerate her, Vic said. Someone who's already proven he'll put her first when it matters. And you need people who see what you did yesterday and understand that's who you really are. Not some quiet kid who's too much trouble. Not someone broken who needs fixing. But someone brave who makes impossible choices and lives with the consequences. You really want to adopt me? Mason asked again, because he needed to hear it one more time. Needed to be absolutely sure he wasn't misunderstanding. I want to give you a home, Mason. I want to give you a sister who already thinks you're a hero. I want to give you a family that won't give up on you, that won't send you back, that won't decide you're not good enough. We're not perfect, but we're real, and we're here. and we're offering. Leon opened the folder and pulled out paperwork, legal documents covered in official stamps and signatures. We've already started the process. Called in favors, expedited the background checks, talked to your caseworker. Ms. Rivera is willing to work with us, says this kind of emergency placement is possible under the circumstances. You can move in as early as today if you want. Foster placement first, then we work toward adoption. Today. Mason's voice cracked. Today, Vic confirmed. If you say yes. If you want this. Mason wanted to say yes. Wanted to scream it. Wanted to throw himself at Vic and Iris and sob with relief and gratitude and overwhelming emotion. But 12 years of rejection had taught him that good things don't happen to kids like him. That offers like this come with catches. That he needed to be careful, to protect himself, to not hope too hard because hope hurt worst of all when it was ripped away. What if I mess it up? Mason asked, the fear finally breaking through. What if I'm not good enough? What if you decide in a week or a month that you made a mistake? Vic's expression softened into something that looked like understanding. Mason, you gave up your future for a kid you'd never met. You pulled her out from under a motorcycle without any training, without any reason to help except that it was the right thing to do. You stayed with her when you could have left. You kept a promise to a terrified little girl, even though it cost you everything. You're already good enough. You've already proven what kind of person you are. But what if? No what ifs, Vic interrupted gently. Life doesn't come with guarantees, Mason. I can't promise we'll be perfect. I can't promise we won't make mistakes or have hard days or struggle sometimes. What I can promise is that we show up, that we don't quit, that we don't send people back when things get complicated. Iris hopped forward on her crutches, closing the distance between herself and Mason until she was right in front of him. Mason, you saved me. You promised you wouldn't leave me, and you kept your promise. Now we're promising we won't leave you. That's fair, right? That's how it works. And there it was, spoken with the simple clarity of a 7-year-old who still believed the world could make sense. You saved me, so now we save you. A trade. A balance. A promise kept in exchange for a promise given. Mason looked at Iris, at her bright pink cast and her mini leather jacket and her absolute certainty that this would all work out. Then he looked at Vic, at this man who'd shown up with 50 bikers at 6 in the morning to thank a homeless kid for helping a stranger. Then he looked at the assembled charter members, at Leon and all the others who'd voted unanimously to let him into their family. Mason wanted to say yes, wanted to scream it. But 12 years of rejection had taught him that good things don't happen to kids like him. That offers like this come with catches. That he needed to be careful, to protect himself, to not hope too hard. But then Iris smiled at him, and Mason remembered. He'd already decided yesterday that this little girl was worth protecting. Maybe it was time to let them protect him back. If you think Mason deserves this, comment, welcome home, Mason. And if you believe that the people who say bikers are dangerous are wrong, that real family is about loyalty and action, not just blood, hit that like button so hard it breaks. Subscribe if you want more stories about real heroes, not the fake ones the trolls worship. Mason's voice came out small and broken, all the fear he'd been holding back finally spilling over. What if I mess it up? What if I'm not good enough? The question hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable, the kind of question that exposed every wound 12 years in the system had carved into his soul. Mason had asked this question silently 100 times before, every time a placement failed, every time a family chose someone else, every time he caught adults looking at him with that particular expression that said he wasn't quite what they'd hoped for. Vic didn't rush to answer. He let the question sit there, let Mason see that he was taking it seriously, considering it with the weight it deserved. Then he spoke, his voice firm but kind. Mason, you gave up your future for a kid you'd never met. You pulled her out from under a motorcycle without any training. You stayed when you could have run. You kept a promise to a stranger's child, even when it cost you everything you'd been working toward. You're already good enough. You've already proven what kind of person you are. But Mason was shaking his head, tears streaming down his face now, without any attempt to hide them. That's different. That was just helping someone. I don't know how to be part of a family. I don't know how to be someone's son or someone's brother. I've never done it before. Not really. Not in a way that lasted. The admission broke something open in Mason's chest, and suddenly he was crying in earnest, great heaving sobs that made his shoulders shake. All the grief from yesterday, all the fear from 12 years of rejection, All the desperate hope and terror of this impossible moment came pouring out in waves he couldn't control. Vic moved forward and did something no adult had done in years. He pulled Mason into a hug. Not a careful, professional side hug like social workers gave. Not an awkward pat on the shoulder. A real hug, arms wrapped around Mason's thin frame, holding him steady while he fell apart. "Neither did I when Iris was born," Vic said quietly, his voice rumbling in his chest where Mason's ear was pressed. "Elena handed me this tiny, screaming baby, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I was terrified. I messed up constantly. Forgot to support her head, couldn't figure out how to change a diaper, burned her bottles, put her onesies on backwards. Elena had to teach me everything. We learned together, Mason. We figured it out as we went." Mason sobbed against Vic's leather vest, getting tears and snot all over the patches that marked this man as president of the Hells Angels. If the situation had been different, it might have been funny. Instead, it was just heartbreaking and hopeful and more real than anything Mason had felt in years. "We'll figure it out together," Vic continued. "You and me and Iris. We'll mess up. We'll have hard days. But we'll learn. That's what families do. They don't give up when things get complicated." Behind them, Mr. Kowalski had stepped out of the shelter, drawn by the commotion and the extraordinary scene unfolding in his parking lot. He stood on the steps watching, his expression complex. He'd run the Grand Street shelter for 17 years. He'd seen hundreds of kids come through these doors, watched them move on to placements both good and bad, celebrated their successes, and mourned their failures. But this was something entirely new. "Mason," Mr. Kowalski said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "This is your choice, son. Nobody's forcing you into anything. If you're not comfortable with this, if you need time to think about it, that's okay. You don't owe these people anything just because you helped in an emergency." Mason pulled back from Vic's embrace and turned to look at the shelter director. Mr. Kowalski's face was kind, concerned, protective in the way he'd always been protective of his kids. "But," Mr. Kowalski continued, "I've run this shelter for 17 years. I've seen a lot of placements, a lot of families, a lot of situations, and I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen a group of people show up at dawn to thank a child for doing the right thing. I've never seen this kind of certainty." He paused. "Whatever you decide, Mason, I support you. We all support you." Mason wiped at his face with the sleeve of Leon's jacket, trying to compose himself. He looked at the gathered bikers, at 50 men who'd driven here before 7 in the morning because one of their own had asked them to. Men who'd voted unanimously to bring him into their family. Men who were waiting patiently, quietly, for a 12-year-old boy to make a decision that would change all their lives. He looked at Iris, balanced on her crutches with a bright smile on her face despite the pain she must be feeling in her fractured ankle. This little girl who'd been through trauma yesterday, but was already looking forward, already imagining him as her brother, already planning their future together. He looked at Vic, this man who'd lost his wife and rebuilt his life and raised a daughter alone, and now wanted to take a chance on a homeless kid he barely knew. And Mason realized something fundamental. He'd already made this choice yesterday, when he dropped his adoption papers and run toward Iris instead of away. When he'd promised her he wouldn't leave and then kept that promise. When he'd decided that helping a stranger was more important than securing his own future. He'd already chosen these people. They were just choosing him back. "Yes," Mason said, his voice stronger now. "I want to try. I want to come live with you." The bikers erupted in cheers. 50 grown men hollering and clapping and whistling like they'd just witnessed something miraculous. Some of them hugged each other. One wiped tears from his eyes. Leon threw his head back and let out a whoop that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Iris dropped one of her crutches and threw her arms around Mason's waist, nearly knocking him over with the force of her enthusiasm. "You're my brother now. You're really my brother." Vic was smiling, actually smiling, this expression of pure relief and joy that transformed his face from intimidating to gentle. "Okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay, let's make this official." Leon pulled out his phone and made a call. "Diana?" "Yeah, it's Leon." He said yes. Yeah, he's sure. "Can you get here? We're at the shelter now." A pause. "She says she's 20 minutes out. She's been waiting at a coffee shop around the corner since 6:30. Mason blinked. "MS. Rivera is here." "Vic called her at dawn," Leon explained. explained the situation, asked if an emergency foster placement was possible. She said she'd need to evaluate the home and do some paperwork, but under the circumstances, with your previous placement falling through and you having nowhere to go, she could expedite things. Vic knelt down again to be at Mason's eye level. We're not perfect, Mason. I need you to understand that. I work long hours at the auto shop I own. The house isn't fancy. Iris can be a handful, especially when she's practicing ballet routines in the living room at 6 in the morning. The club has gatherings that can get loud. We're not the suburban family with a white picket fence. I don't want a white picket fence, Mason said. I just want people who stay. We show up, Vic said firmly. We stay? We don't leave our people behind. That's the club's code, and it's my code as a father. You're not just some foster kid to me, Mason. You saved my daughter. You're family now, and we don't abandon family. Leon stepped forward and put one massive hand on Mason's shoulder. Kid, you're about to have 50 uncles who'll teach you everything from motorcycle maintenance to how to throw a proper punch. We'll teach you how to change oil and rebuild an engine and stand up for yourself when someone tries to push you around. You'll never eat alone again. Never spend a holiday in a shelter. Never wonder if someone's got your back, because brother, we all do. Welcome to the family. The words settled over Mason like a warm blanket, like coming in from the cold, like finding shelter in a storm. Family, uncles, brother, words he'd heard before but never believed applied to him. Can I pack my things? Mason asked. Take your time, Vic said. We're not going anywhere. We'll wait right here. Mason ran back into the shelter, his feet barely touching the ground. The other boys were still clustered by the windows, watching the scene outside with various expressions of shock and envy and confusion. Dude, are you really leaving? Felix asked. Yeah, Mason said, unable to keep the smile off his face. I'm really leaving. With the bikers? With my family. He grabbed his plastic bin from beside his bunk and dumped everything into his backpack. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, his underwear and socks, the photograph of his parents, his journal. Everything he owned in the world fit into one backpack and left room to spare. Mason paused at his bunk and looked around the shelter one last time. This place had been home for 3 years. Not a good home, not a place he'd ever wanted to stay forever, but a safe place when he'd had nowhere else to go. He owed it something. Owed Mr. Kowalski something for keeping him fed and housed and protected. But he didn't belong here anymore. In his head, Mason composed a journal entry he'd write later, when he had time to process everything that was happening. Everything changed. I saved a life and lost my future, and then they gave me a better one. Maybe there is such a thing as family after all. Maybe family isn't about being chosen from a file or meeting in a conference room or signing papers. Maybe family is about showing up, about staying, about people who see you make an impossible choice and understand that's who you really are. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if this will work. But for the first time in 12 years, I'm not afraid to find out. Mason shouldered his backpack and walked back outside into the morning sun. Vic was there, waiting exactly as he'd promised. Iris was there, grinning like Christmas had come early. Leon and 50 other bikers were there, this unlikely family that had claimed him as their own. Ready? Vic asked. Mason nodded. I'm ready. But the story doesn't end there. Because over the next 6 months, Mason would learn what it really means to be part of the Hells Angels family. And what he discovered would challenge everything he thought he knew about belonging. The house was a 3-bedroom ranch on the east side of the city, set back from the street with a driveway wide enough for 3 motorcycles and a garage Vic had converted into a workshop. It wasn't fancy. The paint was weathered, the front lawn needed mowing, and the porch had a loose board that creaked when you stepped on it. But when Vic pulled up on his bike with Mason holding tight to his waist, when he cut the engine and said, "Welcome home, son," it was the most beautiful place Mason had ever seen. Inside, Iris's room exploded with color. Ballet posters covered every wall. Pink tutus hung from hooks. Stuffed animals crowded the bed in careful arrangement. She gave Mason a tour with breathless enthusiasm, pointing out every treasure, every ribbon from recitals, every photograph of her mother that held places of honor on her dresser. Mason's room was at the end of the hall, smaller than Iris's, but with a window that looked out at a park 2 blocks away. A real bed with a real mattress, not the thin shelter issue padding he'd slept on for years. A dresser that was his alone. A closet where he could hang the new clothes Vic had bought him that first afternoon, Tags still on, sizes guessed at, but close enough. A desk with a lamp. Space to breathe. Space to be. That first night, Mason lay in his new bed and couldn't sleep. Not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was too comfortable. Too quiet. Too much his own. He kept waiting for the sound of 14 other boys breathing around him, for Mr. Kowalski's footsteps doing night rounds, for the familiar noises that had marked his nights for 3 years. Instead, there was just silence and the distant sound of Vic watching television in the living room, and the knowledge that this was real, this was happening, this was home. Dinner that first night was chaotic in the best way. Vic made spaghetti, confident and cheerful, until he burned the garlic bread so badly smoke filled the kitchen and set off the alarm. Iris laughed so hard she fell off her chair. Mason couldn't stop grinning, and Vic stood there waving a towel at the ceiling detector, muttering about how Elena had always handled the bread. They ate the spaghetti without garlic bread, and nobody cared. The next day, Iris insisted on teaching Mason her ballet routine. She demonstrated the moves with her ankle still in its cast, improvising around the injury with creative modifications. Mason tried to follow along and discovered he had absolutely no coordination, no grace, no ability whatsoever to execute a pirouette or apply, or whatever the moves were called. They laughed until their stomachs hurt, until Vic came in to see what the commotion was about and found them collapsed on the living room floor in hysterics. School enrollment happened 3 days later. Vic took Mason to register at Lincoln Middle School, walking into the administrative office in his full leather vest with the Hells Angels patches clearly visible. The secretary behind the desk took one look at him, and her smile faltered. But Vic didn't flinch, didn't apologize for who he was. He filled out the paperwork with careful attention to detail, asked about Mason's class placement, inquired about after-school programs. Professional, courteous, exactly what a parent should be. When the first parent-teacher conference came 2 weeks later, Vic showed up in his colors again. Mason watched the teachers' faces, saw them doing the mental calculation, the stereotype versus reality assessment. But Vic asked intelligent questions about Mason's reading level, about his progress in math, about how he was adjusting socially. He took notes. He engaged. And slowly, the teachers relaxed and stopped seeing the vest and started seeing the father. The club became Mason's extended family in ways he hadn't anticipated. Leon took him to the garage on Saturday mornings and taught him motorcycle basics. How to check oil, how to clean spark plugs, how an engine worked from the inside out. Another member named Ray, a former teacher, helped Mason with homework at the kitchen table while Vic cooked dinner. Weekly gatherings at the clubhouse meant meals with dozens of people, loud conversations, laughter, the feeling of belonging to something bigger than himself. But it wasn't all easy. Mason had nightmares, woke up screaming about accidents and blood and Iris trapped under steel. Vic would appear at his bedroom door within seconds, turn on the light, sit on the edge of the bed until Mason's breathing calmed. You're safe. She's safe. Everyone's okay. Mason struggled with attachment in ways he didn't know how to articulate. He tested boundaries constantly, waiting for the moment Vic would give up on him, would decide this was too hard, would send him back. He forgot to do chores on purpose. Talked back. Stayed out 20 minutes past curfew just to see what would happen. What happened was Vic sat him down at the kitchen table and said, Mason, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you're trying to prove, whatever test this is, you can stop. You can't scare me off. You're my son now. That means on the good days and the bad days and the days when you're pushing every button to see if I'll break. I won't break. We're family. That's not conditional. Iris's ankle healed slowly. Mason helped with her physical therapy exercises, counting out repetitions while she grimaced through the pain, celebrating small victories when she could put weight on it again, when she could walk without crutches, when she finally got medical clearance to return to ballet. He drove her to her first class back, borrowed Vic's truck even though he only had a learner's permit, sat in the parking lot, and watched through the window as she attempted her first tentative movements in months. 3 months into the placement, Mason called Vic Dad for the first time. It was an accident, automatic, calling down the hallway. Dad, do we have any more milk? Then freezing when he realized what he'd said, his heart hammering, waiting for correction or rejection. Vic appeared in the kitchen doorway, a small smile on his face. Yes, son. There's a fresh gallon in the back of the fridge. That was it. No big moment. No dramatic acknowledgement. just acceptance, just truth, just family. 6 months after that morning in the shelter parking lot, Vic filed the official adoption papers. Ms. Rivera came by for the home visit, saw Mason's room with his belongings unpacked and his journals lined up on the shelf, saw Iris teaching him a card game at the kitchen table, saw Vic cooking dinner while Mason set the table without being asked. She smiled and signed off on the placement without hesitation. The adoption hearing was set for October 15th. But 2 weeks before it happened, something occurred that would test everything Mason had learned about family and prove that his decision to save Iris that day had created bonds stronger than any piece of paper could. Late September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the trees. Mason had turned 13 2 weeks earlier, celebrated with a small party at the house where Leon had presented him with his first set of motorcycle tools and Iris had baked a lopsided cake that tasted better than it looked. 7 months had passed since that morning in the shelter parking lot. 7 months of learning what family meant, of building trust one day at a time, of slowly believing this was real and permanent and his. The incident happened on a Tuesday during lunch recess. Mason was across the playground with a group of kids from his grade, talking about an upcoming history project, when he heard Iris's voice rise above the general noise of children at play. Not a scream exactly, but something close, something distressed. His head snapped around automatically, that protective instinct that had developed over 7 months of being her brother kicking in immediately. He spotted her near the basketball courts, backed against the chain-link fence by 3 older boys. 8th graders, maybe 9th. Bigger than Mason, certainly bigger than Iris. One of them was doing an exaggerated limp, mocking the slight hitch in Iris's gait that remained from her ankle injury. The residual weakness that her physical therapist said would fade eventually, but hadn't quite disappeared yet. Mason didn't think, didn't calculate the odds or consider the consequences. His body just moved, feet carrying him across the playground in a dead sprint, the same way they'd carried him toward a motorcycle accident 7 months ago when a little girl needed help. Iris was trying to ignore them, her face set in determined neutrality, but Mason could see the tears gathering in her eyes, could see her hands balled into fists at her sides. Could see the moment one of the boys pushed her shoulder, not hard enough to really hurt, but hard enough to make her stumble, and she went down, her weak ankle giving out beneath her. Mason arrived 3 seconds later and positioned himself between Iris and the 3 boys, his body language pure protective fury. He wasn't big, hadn't hit his growth spurt yet, was still all bones and sharp angles. But something in his expression made the boys take a step back. "Leave her alone," Mason said, his voice low and dangerous in a way he didn't quite recognize as his own. The biggest of the 3 boys recovered quickly, his face twisting into a sneer. "Who are you? Her boyfriend? That's disgusting, dude. She's like 10. I'm her brother," Mason said clearly. "And you need to back off." Now, behind him, Iris had gotten to her feet, favoring her right ankle slightly, her hand gripping the back of Mason's shirt. "Mason, it's okay. Let's just go." "Yeah, Mason," the bully mocked. "Listen to your little girlfriend. Just go." "She's my sister," Mason repeated, taking a step forward. "And you're going to apologize for pushing her." The bully laughed, looked at his friends for support, found it in their smirking faces. "Or what? Or I'll make you apologize." The bully pushed Mason's shoulder, the same casual violence he'd used on Iris. Testing. Establishing dominance. Expecting Mason to back down the way most kids did when confronted by someone bigger and older. Mason pushed back. Hard. Both hands against the bully's chest, enough force to send the older boy stumbling backward 2 steps. Then it was chaos. The bully came at Mason swinging. Mason ducked under the first punch, his body moving on instinct and the training Leon had been giving him on Saturday mornings. The second punch caught him in the shoulder, painful but not debilitating. Mason drove his fist into the bully's stomach, heard the satisfying whoosh of air leaving lungs, then caught a glancing blow to his cheek that made his vision spark. The fight lasted maybe 20 seconds before teachers descended and pulled them apart. 20 seconds of fury and adrenaline and protective rage that left Mason's knuckles bleeding and his face bruised, but his conscience clear. He'd defended his sister. He'd done exactly what needed to be done. The principal's office was familiar territory by now, though Mason had never been sent there for fighting before. He sat in the uncomfortable chair outside Principal Morrison's door an ice pack pressed to his cheek, while Iris sat beside him holding his free hand. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did," Mason said simply. Vic arrived 20 minutes later, still in his work clothes from the auto shop, grease under his fingernails and concern etched into his face. He listened to Principal Morrison explain the situation. Zero-tolerance policy for fighting. 3-day suspension. The other boys suspended as well, longer because he'd thrown the first punch, but consequences for Mason regardless. Principal Morrison looked at Vic expectantly, waiting for the parental discipline, the apology, the promise that it wouldn't happen again. Standard procedure when a student got into a fight. Vic turned to Mason. "You started." "No, sir," Mason said automatically, then caught himself. "Sir, not Dad." He'd reverted to the formal address under stress, the old habit of keeping distance, of not assuming. "But I finished it," Mason added. Something flickered across Vic's face. Not disapproval. Something else. Something that might have been pride. Vic turned back to Principal Morrison. "My son defended his sister from 3 boys who were bullying her, who pushed her down. I'm not going to punish him for that." Principal Morrison's expression tightened. "Mr. Brennan, we have a zero-tolerance policy for violence. It doesn't matter who started it. And I have a zero-tolerance policy for people hurting my kids." Vic interrupted, his voice calm but absolutely firm. 3 boys cornered my daughter, mocked her disability, pushed her to the ground, and my son protected her. That's not violence. That's family. We're done here. Mr. Brennan." Vic stood up. "Mason, Iris, let's go." They walked out of the school together, Mason's suspension paperwork in Vic's hand, Iris still limping slightly as she matched their pace. Nobody spoke until they were in Vic's truck, the 3 of them crammed into the front bench seat the way they always rode when they went places together. The silence stretched for 5 minutes as Vic navigated through afternoon traffic. Mason stared out the window, his adrenaline crashing, exhaustion settling into his bones. His cheek throbbed. His knuckles hurt. But underneath it all was a strange sense of rightness, of having done exactly what needed to be done. "You called her your sister," Vic said finally, his eyes on the road. Mason's heart skipped. "She is my sister. And you call me sir, not Dad." Mason's throat tightened. "I didn't want to assume. In the principal's office, with everything official, I thought maybe I should be more formal." Vic pulled the truck over, right there on the side of the road, and put it in park. Then he turned to look at Mason directly, his expression serious. "Mason, you're my son. Papers or no papers. That was settled the day you stayed with Iris instead of going to your meeting. The day you chose her over your own future. Everything since then has just been making it official. You don't call me sir. You call me Dad. Because that's what I am. That's what I've been since the morning I showed up at your shelter with 50 brothers to bring you home." The tears came before Mason could stop them, the 3rd time he'd cried since that day in the intersection 7 months ago. First when the bikers had applauded him. Second when Vic had first hugged him. Now this, the absolute confirmation that he belonged, that he was chosen, that this was permanent and real and true. "Okay," Mason managed. "Okay, Dad." Iris threw her arms around both of them. This awkward 3-way hug in the front seat of a pickup truck parked on the side of a busy street. Vic held them both, his kids, his family, the daughter he'd almost lost, and the son who'd saved her. When they finally pulled apart, Vic was smiling. "Also, good job on the right hook. Leon will be proud. Your form was solid. We'll work on your footwork though. You were too flat-footed." Mason laughed despite the tears still wet on his face. "Leon's been teaching me. I know. He tells me everything. You're doing good, son. Better than good. You're exactly who I hoped you'd be." They drove home in comfortable silence. The crisis passed. The test passed. The bond between them stronger for having been challenged. Mason had defended his sister. Vic had defended his son. Iris sat between them, safe and loved and protected by people who would fight for her, literally if necessary. 2 weeks later, Mason stood in a courtroom wearing a borrowed suit. The judge asked him if he wanted Vic to become his legal father. And what Mason said next would become family legend, the moment everyone knew this adoption was more than just paperwork. October 15th arrived with clear skies and cool temperatures, the kind of autumn day that felt like a gift. The family courthouse sat downtown in a building that had stood for 80 years, its stone facade weathered but dignified, its courtrooms filled with stories of families broken and families made whole. Today would be the latter. Mason wore a suit borrowed from Leon's nephew, a kid who'd aged out of the system 2 years ago and was now working construction with the club's help. The suit was slightly too big in the shoulders, but fit well enough once Vic had adjusted the tie. Mason had never worn a tie before that morning. Vic had taught him how to knot it, patient and careful, their reflections side by side in the bathroom mirror. Vic wore a dress shirt and tie as well, his leather vest left at home out of respect for the formality of the occasion. It felt strange seeing him without the colors, like seeing a fundamental part of him missing. But he'd explained it to Mason the night before. The court doesn't need to see the club. They need to see your father. And I can be both. But today, father comes first. Iris wore a yellow dress that made her look older than 8, her dark curls pinned back with clips that sparkled when she moved. The decorative crutch she carried was covered in stickers she'd collected over the months of recovery, a rainbow timeline of her healing. She didn't need it anymore, her ankle fully healed, but she'd insisted on bringing it. For good luck, she'd said. It reminds us how we all met. They arrived at the courthouse at 8:45 for their 9 o'clock hearing. The gallery was already filling with people. 30 Hells Angels members, all dressed in civilian clothes, no colors, no vests, just men in their best shirts and cleanest jeans. They'd taken time off work, driven in from across the city, shown up because one of their own was making his family official, and that mattered. That meant something. Ms. Rivera was there, wearing a professional blazer and carrying a folder thick with documentation. She'd been Mason's caseworker for 4 years now, had seen him through rejection after rejection, had held on to hope when he'd given up on it himself. Today her eyes were already bright with emotion and the hearing hadn't even started. The bailiff called the courtroom to order at precisely 9 o'clock. Judge Patricia Morrison entered, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every variation of human drama the family court system could produce. She sat at her bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and opened the file in front of her. In the matter of the adoption petition of Victor James Brennan regarding the minor child Mason Daniel Porter, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. We are here today to determine if this adoption is in the best interests of the child and should be granted by this court. The formality of it made Mason's stomach flutter with nerves. This was real. This was happening. After 8 months of living with Vic and Iris, after 8 months of learning what family meant, they were making it permanent, legal, unbreakable. Ms. Rivera was called to testify first. She took the stand with practiced ease, placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth. Ms. Rivera, Judge Morrison said, "You've been Mason's caseworker for how long?" "4 years, Your Honor." "And you've overseen this placement with Mr. Brennan for the past 8 months?" "Yes, Your Honor." "I've conducted regular home visits, spoken with Mason privately, observed the family dynamic extensively. What is your professional assessment?" Ms. Rivera smiled, genuine and warm. "Your Honor, I've been a social worker for 20 years. I've seen hundreds of placements. Some work, some don't. But I have never seen a placement this successful. Mason has thrived in every measurable way. His grades have improved dramatically. His attendance is perfect. His confidence has grown. The psychological evaluations show healthy attachment with no behavioral concerns. This is exactly what we hope for when we place a child, and it happens far less often than I wish it did." Judge Morrison made notes, nodded. "Thank you, Ms. Rivera." The school counselor testified next, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson who'd worked with Mason since his enrollment. She spoke about his academic progress, his social integration, the notable change in his demeanor over 8 months. "Mason came to us quiet and withdrawn," she said. "He's leaving us confident and engaged. That's the difference a stable home makes." The psychological evaluation was entered into evidence. Dr. Chun, the psychologist who'd assessed Mason twice during the placement period, had written in her report that Mason demonstrated secure attachment patterns, age-appropriate emotional regulation, and no indicators of trauma or distress related to the current placement. Her recommendation was unequivocal. Grant the adoption. Judge Morrison read through the documentation in silence, the courtroom holding its breath. Mason sat at the table with Vic on one side and the lawyer on the other, his hands folded in his lap, trying to sit still despite the nervous energy coursing through him. Finally, Judge Morrison looked up. Her eyes found Mason's across the courtroom. "Mason," she said, her voice gentler now, Please stand. Mason stood, his legs slightly unsteady. Vic started to stand with him, but the judge shook her head slightly. This question was for Mason alone. Son, do you understand what adoption means? Mason's throat was dry, but his voice came out clear. Yes, Your Honor. It means permanent. That's right. Adoption means Mr. Brennan becomes your legal father. Your name becomes Mason Brennan. This can't be undone. It's not like foster care where placements can change. This is forever. Do you understand that? Yes, Your Honor. And knowing all of that, with full understanding of what this means, do you want Mr. Brennan to adopt you? Do you want him to become your legal father? Mason had practiced his answer, had planned to simply say yes, politely and clearly, the way you were supposed to answer judges. But standing there in that borrowed suit, with 30 bikers in the gallery and Iris gripping her lucky crutch and Vic sitting beside him with hope and love written across his face, Mason realized he needed to say more. Needed to explain what this moment meant, what this family meant, what the past 8 months had taught him. Your Honor, Mason said, I want to tell you something. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Judge Morrison raised her eyebrows slightly, but nodded. Go ahead. Mason took a breath. 8 months ago, I thought family was something that happened to other kids. I thought I'd spend my whole life waiting for someone to choose me from a file, waiting for some family to decide I was good enough. I had an adoption meeting scheduled, my first real chance, and I thought that was going to change everything. He paused, gathering his thoughts, aware that every person in the courtroom was hanging on his words. Then I met Iris and Vic. And I learned that family isn't about being chosen. It's about choosing each other. Mason glanced at Vic, saw the emotion swimming in his father's eyes, found the courage to continue. I chose to save Iris because it was right. Because she needed help and I could give it, even though it cost me everything I'd been working toward. Vic chose to adopt me because he's a good man who saw that choice and understood what it meant. And every day since then, we've chosen to be there for each other. We've chosen to show up, to stay, to be family even when it's hard. His voice grew stronger, more certain. So yes, Your Honor, I want Vic to be my dad. I want Iris to be my sister officially. I want the name Brennan and everything that comes with it. But really, he already is my dad. She already is my sister. This paperwork we're doing today, it's just making official what's been true since the day they showed up at my shelter with 50 motorcycles and told me I mattered. That I was worth fighting for. That I was family. The courtroom was so quiet Mason could hear his own heartbeat. Judge Morrison was blinking rapidly, her professional composure cracking slightly. She cleared her throat and wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Mr. Brennan, she said, her voice thick with emotion, approach the bench with your son. Vic stood, and together they walked to stand before the judge. Mason could feel his father's presence beside him, solid and steady and permanent. His dad. That's what Vic was, papers or no papers. But after today there would be no question. No uncertainty. No possibility of it being taken away. Judge Morrison looked at them both for a long moment. This man and this boy who'd found each other in the wreckage of a motorcycle accident, who'd built a family from impossible circumstances, who'd proven that love didn't require biology, just commitment. It is the judgment of this court, Judge Morrison said, her voice ringing clear and official, that the adoption petition is granted. Victor James Brennan is hereby recognized as the legal father of Mason Daniel Brennan, with all rights, responsibilities, and privileges thereof. This adoption is final and irrevocable. She raised her gavel. Mason Brennan, welcome to your forever family. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like a starting gun. Then everything erupted into chaos. 30 bikers leaped to their feet applauding and cheering. Ms. Rivera was crying openly. The lawyer was smiling. The bailiff was grinning despite his attempt at professional neutrality. Iris dropped her decorative crutch and ran to Mason and Vic, throwing her arms around both of them with such force she nearly knocked them over. We're really brothers and sisters now. Really, really officially. Mason hugged her back, this little girl who'd changed his life, who'd given him a family by needing him in her darkest moment. We always were, Iris. Now it's just official. Vic pulled them both close, his arms strong and protective around his children, his family, the people who mattered most in his world. Mason heard his father's voice, rough with emotion, whisper against his hair. Welcome home, son. For real this time. Forever. Mason Brennan, he thought. His name was Mason Brennan now. Not Mason Porter, the foster kid who bounced through placements. Not just Mason, the invisible boy in the shelter system. Mason Brennan, son of Victor, brother of Iris, member of a family that had chosen him and been chosen in return. The bikers surrounded them, this wall of leather-free but no less formidable men, offering congratulations and backslaps and handshakes. Leon lifted Iris onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowd. Someone started a chant of, "Mason, Mason." That was quickly shushed by the bailiff, but not before everyone joined in for a few enthusiastic repetitions. If this story proves that good people still exist, comment, "Faith restored." If you believe that heroes deserve happy endings, smash that like button. And if you think the system should do more to help kids like Mason, subscribe and share this story, because every share might reach someone who needed to hear it. The trolls who say bikers are criminals? This story just proved them completely wrong. 1 year after the accident, 365 days since Mason had dropped his adoption papers and run toward a little girl trapped under a motorcycle. 12 months since his life had split into before and after, since everything he thought he knew about family had been rewritten in the span of 6 hours. Mason was 14 now, taller by 3 inches, broader in the shoulders, his voice deeper and steadier. The hollow look that had haunted his eyes for 12 years was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like contentment. He stood in Vic's garage on a Saturday afternoon in early October, his hands covered in grease, helping his father rebuild the carburetor on a 1972 Harley-Davidson shovelhead that had been sitting in pieces for months. "Hand me the 9/16", Vic said without looking up from the engine. Mason found the wrench in the toolbox and passed it over, their movements synchronized from months of working together like this. Saturday mornings in the garage had become their ritual, their time, the hours where they talked about everything and nothing while their hands stayed busy with metal and mechanics. Through the open garage door, they could hear Iris practicing ballet in the driveway. 9 years old now, her ankle fully healed, no trace of the limp that had once marked her movements. She was preparing for her winter recital, determined to execute a series of pirouettes she'd been working on for weeks. Mason had promised to watch, to be her audience, to tell her honestly whether she was ready. "Looking good, Iris," Mason called out. "Keep your core tight on the landing." "I am," she shouted back, breathless from exertion. Mason's life had settled into a rhythm that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Honor roll student at Lincoln Middle School, something that shocked his teachers who remembered the quiet, withdrawn boy who'd enrolled 8 months earlier. Active member of the club community, helping at the clubhouse with event planning and maintenance, earning the respect of men 3 times his age. And once a month, he went back to the Grand Street shelter with Ms. Rivera to talk to the current residents, to tell them his story, to offer hope to kids who were still waiting for their own families to find them. Just last week, he'd sat across from an 11-year-old girl named Carmen who'd been in the system for 6 years and told her, "It only takes one person to change everything. One person who sees you and decides you're worth showing up for. Don't give up. Your person is out there." Vic tightened the last bolt on the carburetor and sat back, wiping his hands on a rag already black with grease. He watched Mason work for a moment, this boy who'd become his son, this kid who'd saved his daughter and somehow saved himself in the process. "You know," Vic said casually, "you could have run that day, could have made your meeting." Mason didn't look up from the spark plug he was cleaning. "I know. Iris would have been okay. Eventually. The paramedics were coming. Someone else would have helped. Maybe," Mason said. "But she was scared. She needed someone to stay. I couldn't leave her like that, even knowing what it would cost you." Mason finally looked up, meeting his father's eyes. "But then I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be your son. Iris wouldn't be my sister. I'd be with the Hoffmans, or maybe some other family, and they might have been fine. But they wouldn't have been this." Vic nodded slowly. "Any regrets?" "Not a single one," Mason said with absolute certainty. "Iris needed help. That was more important than what I needed, or what I thought I needed." "That's the thing about family, Mason," Vic said, his voice quiet but firm. "Sometimes what they need becomes what you need. You saved Iris because it was right. But in saving her, you gave me back hope. You gave me a son. You gave Iris a brother. You gave all of us something we didn't even know we were missing." Mason set down his tools and looked at his father, this man who'd shown up with 50 motorcycles and offered him a chance when nobody else would. "Dad, Yes, son. Thank you. For showing up. For staying. For not giving up on me when I tested every boundary trying to make you leave. For just being my dad. Vic reached out and put his grease-stained hand on Mason's shoulder, the gesture both casual and weighted with meaning. Thank you for saving my daughter. And for letting us save you back. That took courage too, you know. Trusting us. Believing this was real. That takes a different kind of bravery than running into traffic to help a stranger. They worked in comfortable silence for a while longer, the sound of tools and Iris's music and the ordinary noises of a Saturday afternoon filling the garage. Mason thought about the Hoffmans sometimes, wondered what his life would have been like if he'd made that meeting. Ms. Rivera had told him a few months ago that they'd adopted a different child, a 10-year-old boy named Marcus who was thriving in their suburban home with the golden retriever and the quiet stability Mason had once imagined for himself. Good, Mason had thought. They got their son. I got my family. Everyone ended up where they belonged. Because that was the truth he'd learned over the past year. Sometimes you lose what you thought you wanted and find what you actually needed. Sometimes the thing that looks like the end of your story is actually just the beginning. Sometimes saving someone else's life means saving your own in ways you never expected. Outside, Iris completed her series of pirouettes and stuck the landing, throwing her arms up in triumph. Did you see that, Mason? I did it. Mason walked to the garage door, leaning against the frame, grinning at his sister. I saw it. That was perfect. You're totally ready for the recital. Will you come? Both of you. Wouldn't miss it, Mason said. Front row seats, Vic added, coming to stand beside Mason. Wouldn't be anywhere else. Iris beamed and launched into the routine again, her joy evident in every movement. This little girl who'd survived trauma and come out the other side stronger. Mason watched her, still feeling that protective surge he'd felt a year ago, that instant understanding that she mattered, that her safety was worth any cost. Vic's arms settled around Mason's shoulders, and Mason leaned into the embrace automatically. No hesitation, no fear that affection would be withdrawn. Just the comfortable certainty of family, of belonging, of home. The afternoon sun slanted through the garage door, painting everything in warm gold. A motorcycle in pieces waiting to be rebuilt. Grease-stained tools scattered across the workbench. A ballet-dancing girl in the driveway. A father and son standing together watching her. A family that had been forged in crisis and tempered through trust, built on the foundation of an impossible choice and a dozen smaller choices made every day since. This was home. This was family. This was where Mason Brennan belonged. And it all started with a boy who chose to help a stranger instead of pursuing his own future, never knowing that helping her would give him a future worth more than anything he'd imagined. Mason's story could have ended very differently. Think about that for a moment. Think about the choice he faced at that intersection on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, 12 years old with an adoption letter in his pocket and 32 minutes to reach the most important meeting of his life. What if he'd kept walking? It's not an unreasonable question. Most people would have. Most people would have seen the accident, felt that surge of sympathy and concern, maybe called 911, and then continued on their way. After all, Mason had somewhere to be, something crucial waiting for him, his entire future hanging in the balance. Nobody would have blamed him for prioritizing his own needs, his own chance at a family, over a stranger's emergency. But if Mason had kept walking, if he'd made that meeting with the Hoffmans, Iris might not have made it. The bystanders were filming, not helping. The paramedics were still minutes away. That fuel leak was spreading, the motorcycle pinning her leg, the pain and terror overwhelming. She needed someone to stay, someone to promise they wouldn't leave, someone to keep that promise. Mason gave her that. Gave up everything he'd ever wanted to give a 7-year-old girl, the thing she needed most in that moment. Someone who cared enough to stay. The choice was impossible. There's no denying that. No 12-year-old should have to choose between their own future and a stranger's life. No child should face that kind of moral calculus, that kind of devastating either-or. But Mason made the choice anyway. Made it in seconds, with his heart instead of his head, with courage instead of calculation. And that choice changed everything. Because here's what we learned from Mason's story. Family isn't built on blood or paperwork. It's built on choice and loyalty. It's built on showing up and staying, on protecting the people who matter even when it costs you something. The Brennans aren't a traditional family. A biker dad, a ballet dancing daughter, and a foster kid who became a son through an act of selfless courage. But they're more of a family than many people with matching DNA and legal documents ever managed to become. Mason's story teaches us that heroism isn't about superpowers or perfect circumstances. It's about doing the right thing even when it costs you everything. It's about seeing someone in need and helping even when walking away would be easier, safer, more practical. Real heroes don't calculate the cost. They just act. They just help. They just stay. The foster care system fails kids like Mason every single day. Children age out without families, without support, without anyone who believes they're worth fighting for. It's a tragedy that plays out in silence, in statistics nobody pays attention to, in lives that fall through cracks in a system that's underfunded and overwhelmed. But sometimes, humanity prevails. Sometimes, the right people show up at the right time. Sometimes, a community sees a child in need and says, "Not on our watch." The Hells Angels aren't what most people imagine when they think of family builders or child advocates. The stereotypes run deep, dangerous, criminal, violent. But Vic and his charter brothers proved those stereotypes wrong. They're a community built on loyalty and protection. They're men who understand that family means showing up, that love is measured in action, not words. When they learned what Mason had sacrificed to save one of their own, they didn't hesitate. They showed up. They stayed. They offered him exactly what he'd given Iris, a chance. One moment of courage changed multiple lives forever. Mason saved Iris that day, but in saving her, he saved himself. He gave Vic back hope and purpose. He gave Iris a brother who would fight for her literally, if necessary. He gave 50 bikers a reminder of what matters most: protecting the innocent, honoring sacrifice, building family where you find it. Today, Mason volunteers with Ms. Rivera at the Grand Street Shelter, talking to foster kids about hope and resilience, and not giving up even when it feels like nobody will ever choose you. The club started a fund for foster children's emergency needs, helping kids who fall through the system's cracks, making sure that when crisis hits, there's support available. Mason's story became their mission. His courage became their call to action. Mason gave up his future to save a stranger's child. And in return, he gained a future worth saving for. A family that chose him. A home that wanted him. A life built on the foundation of one impossible choice made in the span of 5 seconds on a Tuesday afternoon. If this story changed how you see bikers, comment respect. If you believe that every child deserves a family like Mason found, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs hope today. Your like, your comment, your share, it all matters. It tells the algorithm that stories about real human kindness deserve to be seen. Let's prove that compassion is more powerful than hate. Thank you for staying until the end. Mason's story is over, but there are thousands more kids still waiting. Let's not forget them. This is a true story of courage, sacrifice, and the family we choose. Mason Brennan's journey from a homeless shelter to a loving home wasn't written in any guidebook. It didn't follow the normal path of foster care placements and carefully scheduled meetings. It was forged in crisis, in those impossible 5 seconds when a 12-year-old boy chose a stranger's life over his own future. And it was sealed by a community of bikers who understood that real family isn't about blood or paperwork. It's about loyalty, about showing up, about staying when things get hard. If Mason's story moved you, if it changed how you think about foster care or motorcycle clubs, or what it means to be a hero, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now. Leave a comment telling me what part of this story hit you hardest. Was it Mason's impossible choice at the intersection? Was it Vic showing up with 50 bikers to offer him a home? Was it that moment in the courtroom when Mason explained what family really means? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be heard, that real human kindness needs to be celebrated in a world that often focuses on the worst of humanity, subscribe to this channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories of courage and compassion and communities coming together when it matters most. Stories that prove good people still exist, that heroes walk among us, that hope is real. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe you know a foster kid who's losing hope. Maybe you know someone who's judged bikers without knowing their stories. Maybe you just know someone who needs a reminder that the world can be beautiful and surprising and full of second chances. Share it with them. Your share might change someone's day, might give them the hope they needed to keep going, might remind them that their story isn't over yet. Next time, we'll tell you about the grandmother who stood up to an entire biker gang to protect her neighborhood, and what happened when they discovered why she was so fearless. You won't believe where that story goes. It involves a decades-old secret, a promise made to a dying soldier, and a revelation that brought the toughest men in the city to their knees. You're not going to want to miss it. Until then, remember Mason's story. Remember that one moment of courage can change everything. That family is built on choice, not obligation. That heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear borrowed shirts and run toward danger when everyone else is filming it on their phones. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for caring about kids like Mason. Thank you for being part of a community that believes compassion matters more than clicks, that real stories matter more than fake drama, that human kindness deserves to be celebrated. I'll see you in the next one. Stay kind, stay hopeful, and never stop believing that good people exist. This is your reminder that somewhere out there, right now, there's a kid like Mason waiting for their Vic Brennan to show up. Let's not forget them.